In the grim darkness of the far future, there exists a relationship so complex, so layered with tragedy and deception, that it defines the very foundation of the Imperium of man. It is the relationship between the Emperor of mankind and his 20 genetically engineered sons, the Primarchs. These beings were created to be the greatest generals humanity had ever known, demigods in flesh who would lead the Emperor's legions across the stars and reclaim the galaxy in his name. They were meant to be his tools, his instruments of conquest, extensions of his divine will made manifest in transhuman form. But here is the terrible truth that echoes through 10,000 years of warfare and suffering. The Emperor feared them. Not the abstract fear of a general concerned for his troops, not the worry of a father for his children's safety. No, this was something far more primal and calculating. The master of mankind, the most powerful psyker to ever walk among mortals, the being who had guided humanity through millennia of darkness, feared his own creations with a cold, rational dread that shaped every decision he made regarding them. This fear was not weakness, it was recognition. The Emperor understood, perhaps better than anyone, exactly what he had created when he forged the Primarchs. He knew their power, their potential, and most dangerously, their capacity to rival even him. He saw in them not just generals and warriors, but potential usurpers, alternative centers of loyalty and worship, beings who could inspire the kind of devotion that he needed exclusively for himself if his great plan for humanity was to succeed. The Primarchs were living paradoxes, simultaneously the Emperor's greatest achievement and his most dangerous liability. They were necessary for his conquest of the galaxy, yet their very existence threatened the ultimate goal of that conquest. They were tools he needed to use, yet tools so powerful they might turn in his hand. They were weapons he had forged, yet weapons that possessed their own wills, their own ambitions, their own capacity to make choices that ran counter to his designs. Understanding why the Emperor feared the Primarchs requires us to look beyond the simple narrative of father and sons, beyond the tragedy of the Horus heresy, into the cold calculations of a being who had lived for tens of thousands of years and who saw humanity not as it was, but as it needed to become. It requires us to examine the very nature of power, control, and the price of creating beings who approach divinity. It demands that we confront uncomfortable truths about the Emperor's true nature and his ultimate plans for both the Primarchs and humanity itself. The scattering of the Primarchs across the galaxy, their discovery one by one during the Great Crusade, the lies and secrets the Emperor kept from them, his treatment of them not as sons, but as resources to be managed, the ultimate betrayal that split the galaxy in civil war. All of these events were shaped by this fundamental fear. Every decision the Emperor made regarding the Primarchs, from their creation to their deployment to his interactions with them, was influenced by his recognition that they represented the only force in the galaxy that could truly threaten his vision for humanity. This is not a story of love betrayed, though many would paint it that way. It is a story of control, of manipulation, of a being so focused on his ultimate goal that he treated even his own genetic legacy as expendable pieces in a game of cosmic chess. It is the story of why the Emperor of mankind, Master of Terror, Lord of the Imperium, the being called the Anathema by the Chaos Gods themselves, lived in fear of 20 genetically engineered warriors who called him Father. Let us descend into the depths of this terrible relationship and understand the fear that shaped an empire and broke a galaxy. The Molech bargain and the seeds of fear. To understand why the Emperor feared the Primarchs, we must first understand how they were created, for their origin contains the seeds of everything that followed. The Emperor was many things, a master of genetics, a supreme psyker, a being of incomprehensible age and power, but even he had limits. The creation of beings like the Primarchs, transhuman demigods who would stand head and shoulders above even the Space Marines, required knowledge and power beyond what even he possessed naturally. This is where the story takes us to Molech, a world that would become a night world of the Imperium, but which held secrets far older and darker than anyone but the Emperor knew. In ages past, during what would later be called the Dark Age of technology, the being who would become the Emperor traveled to Molech with several companions, including the perpetual Olivia Soreka. What they found there changed everything. Beneath the surface of Molech lay a gateway, a portal that led directly into the warp itself, into the realm of chaos, where the four great powers of the Imperium held dominion. The Emperor entered that gateway alone, leaving his companions to wait and wonder what transpired in that meeting between the man who would guide humanity and the gods who would become his greatest enemies. What happened in the warp that day remains shrouded in mystery and contradiction, but the outcome is clear. The Emperor emerged from that portal wielding power he had not possessed before. He had made a bargain with the Chaos Gods themselves, trading something of himself for the knowledge and energy necessary to create the Primarchs. The exact terms of that bargain have never been fully revealed, but we know its fruits. 20 beings of incredible power, each one imbued with a fragment of the Emperor's own essence, enhanced by techniques drawn from both the highest peaks of genetic science and the darkest depths of warp sorcery. But here is where the Emperor's fear began to take root. By necessity, the Primarchs were created using the energies of chaos itself. They were beings of both the material and immaterial, their superhuman bodies housing souls that blazed bright in the warp like beacons drawing the attention of every entity in that realm of madness and hunger. The Emperor had imbued them with nearly godlike levels of charisma and capability, but in doing so, he had also made them vulnerable to the very forces he had bargained with to create them. The Emperor understood this vulnerability from the moment of their creation. He knew that the Chaos Gods would never forget the bargain he had made, would never forgive what they saw as his betrayal when he failed to uphold his end of whatever agreement they had reached. The Primarchs, created with the gods' own power, would be targets for corruption from the moment they drew breath. They were weapons forged from the energy of chaos itself, pointed at chaos's throat, and the gods would not allow such weapons to remain in the Emperor's hands unchallenged. This was the first layer of fear. The Emperor had created 20 beings of immense power, using techniques and energies that made them inherently susceptible to corruption by his greatest enemies. He had forged weapons that he knew could potentially be turned against him, not through any flaw in their loyalty, but through the manipulations of powers that existed beyond the material universe. But there was more to his fear than simply the threat of chaos corruption. The Primarchs were designed to be generals, leaders, beings capable of commanding entire armies and making strategic decisions on a galactic scale. This meant they needed intelligence that approached the Emperor's own, charisma that could inspire absolute loyalty in their followers, and the capacity for independent thought and action. They could not be simple automata following programmed instructions. They needed to be creative, adaptive, capable of responding to situations the Emperor had not anticipated. This necessity created an inherent tension. The Emperor needed the Primarchs to be powerful enough and independent enough to command his legions and conquer the galaxy. But that very independence, that capacity for individual thought and choice, meant they could potentially make decisions that ran counter to his plans. They were not slaves bound to his will. They were individuals with their own thoughts, their own perspectives, their own desires and ambitions. The Emperor recognized this from the beginning. He understood that in creating beings powerful enough to serve his purposes, he had created beings powerful enough to potentially oppose him. It was a calculated risk, but a risk nonetheless. The Primarchs were necessary for his plan to reunite humanity under the Imperium, but they were also potential rivals for the loyalty of that Imperium, alternative centers of authority who might one day question his decisions or his right to rule. Think about what the Emperor had created: 20 beings, each one embodying different aspects of warfare and leadership. The lion was the master of strategy and warfare. Fulgrim represented the pursuit of perfection. Perturabo was the master of siege warfare and fortification. The Khan embodied speed and maneuver. Leman Russ was the savage warrior and executioner. Rogel Dawn was the unyielding defender. Conrad Kersey represented judgment and terror. Sanguinius was nobility and sacrifice. Ferrus Manus was strength and craftsmanship. Angron, even before his mutilation, represented rage turned to purpose. Each was a weapon designed for a specific purpose, but each was also a complete being with the capacity to grow beyond that purpose. The Emperor had not created machines. He had created demigods, and demigods have a disturbing tendency to develop their own agendas. The creation process itself revealed the Emperor's understanding of the threat they posed. He inscribed arcane protective glyphs on their gestation capsules, warding them against the predations of the warp. He constructed the most powerful Gellerfield ever made around the gene vault beneath the Himalayan mountains where they were being developed. These were not simply precautions against external threats. They were acknowledgements that what he was creating was dangerous enough to require the highest levels of containment and protection. And then came the scattering. In a single catastrophic event, all 20 Primarchs were torn from their gestation chambers and cast through the warp to distant worlds across the galaxy. The official story is that the Chaos Gods orchestrated this theft, breaching the Emperor's defenses and stealing away his sons before they could be raised under his guidance. But there are other theories, darker possibilities that some Primarchs themselves came to believe. What if the scattering was not theft, but release? What if the Emperor, understanding the threat that 20 fully realized Primarchs raised under his direct supervision might pose, allowed them to be scattered? What if he even orchestrated it himself, using the Chaos Gods as unknowing pawns in a game that saw his creations dispersed across the galaxy, shaped by harsh worlds and terrible circumstances that would mold them into the weapons he needed rather than the rivals they might have become? Consider the evidence. Several Primarchs, including Conrad Kurz, Robert Gilliman, and Sanguinius, came to believe that their scattering was no accident, but part of the Emperor's plan. They saw patterns in how events unfolded, noticed the convenient timing of the Emperor's arrival on their worlds, recognized that their trials had shaped them in specific ways that served his purposes. The Emperor always seemed to arrive at the perfect moment in each Primarch's life. He found Angron just as he was preparing to make his final stand with his fellow slaves. He discovered the Khan shortly after he had unified his world. He came to Mortarion just as the Primarch was preparing to challenge the Overlord who had raised him. These moments of discovery were too perfectly timed to be mere coincidence, and the worlds themselves seemed almost designed to produce specific types of warriors. Fenris, the death world of ice and wolves, created Leman Russ, the savage warrior. Nostramo, the crime-ridden nightmare world, forged Conrad Kurzer, the judge and executioner. Nuceria and its gladiatorial pits created Angron, though that creation was twisted by the butcher's nails. Each world seemed to amplify certain traits that the Emperor had built into each Primarch's genetic template. This suggests a level of planning and manipulation that goes far beyond simple creation. It suggests that the Emperor understood the Primarchs needed to be shaped by adversity, needed to be hardened by experiences he could not provide under his direct supervision, needed to become weapons tempered in the fires of suffering, rather than generals raised in the halls of terror. But this very shaping through suffering would become one of the seeds of the heresy. By allowing the Primarchs to be scattered and shaped by harsh worlds and terrible circumstances, the Emperor ensured they would be effective weapons. But he also ensured they would carry scars, both physical and psychological, that made them vulnerable to manipulation. He created tools, but he created damaged tools, and damaged tools have a way of breaking when placed under stress. The Emperor's fear, then, began with creation. He feared what he had been forced to create, using the energies of chaos. He feared the independence he had necessarily built into them. He feared their potential to rival his own power and authority. And he took steps, from the moment of their creation, to manage and contain that threat. But in taking those steps, in treating them as threats to be managed rather than sons to be raised, he planted the seeds of the very betrayal he feared most. Tools, not sons. The cold truth of the Emperor's perspective. To understand the depth of the Emperor's fear regarding the Primarchs, we must confront an uncomfortable truth that shatters the narrative many prefer to believe. The Emperor did not love the Primarchs as a father loves his sons. He did not even see them as sons in any meaningful sense. To the master of mankind, the Primarchs were weapons, tools created for a specific purpose, resources to be deployed and managed in service of his grand vision for humanity. This truth is not speculation or interpretation. It comes directly from the Emperor himself, revealed in his interactions with the Primarchs and his statements about them when he believed none would hear. When the Mechanicum's Arcan land aided the Emperor in investigating Angron and the butcher's nails implanted in his brain, the Emperor explained his perspective with brutal clarity. He had no emotional attachment to the Primarchs. They were tools and weapons, nothing more. This revelation strips away the comfortable fiction that the Horus heresy was a tragedy of love betrayed, of a father's plan undone by his son's rebellion. The truth is darker and more complex. The heresy was the inevitable result of treating sentient beings of near godlike power as objects to be used rather than individuals to be respected. It was the fruit of cold manipulation rather than the failure of affection. The Emperor's treatment of the Primarchs reflected this perspective throughout the Great Crusade. He allowed them to call him father, allowed them to refer to themselves as his sons, but he rarely spoke those words himself. When he did, it was without sincerity, a calculated use of familial language to maintain the fiction of their relationship, rather than any expression of genuine feeling. He cloaked his manipulations in the appearance of love, and the Primarchs, for the most part, believed the fiction. This is the testimony of Roboute Guilliman himself, one of the most loyal Primarchs, upon his return in the 41st millennium. When Guilliman stood before the Golden Throne and communed with the Emperor after 10,000 years, he was disturbed by what he encountered. The Primarch felt that the Emperor had lost all pretense of humanity, that he gave off an overwhelming sense of coldness. The Emperor greeted Guilliman with interest, but as a creator would regard a long-lost tool, not as a father would welcome a son. Guilliman feared that the centuries of suffering had stripped away whatever warmth and humanity the Emperor had once possessed. But Guilliman was wrong about one thing. It was not the suffering that had stripped away the Emperor's humanity. That coldness, that lack of genuine affection, had always been there. The suffering had merely removed the Emperor's need to maintain the pretense. When he walked abroad in flesh, he had cloaked his manipulations in the appearance of love. He had let the Primarchs call him father. He had let them believe he loved them in return. But buffeted by the full might of the Emperor's will, unclothed in flesh, Guilliman finally saw the truth. The Emperor had never loved them. He had used them. This perspective fundamentally shaped how the Emperor managed and deployed the Primarchs. He played to their strengths and weaknesses, not as a father nurturing children, but as a commander deploying assets. Angron was sent into the bloodiest assaults, not because the Emperor cared about his condition or his pain, but because that was what the weapon called Angron was designed to do. Magnus was valued for his psychic abilities and knowledge of the warp, useful for the Webway project, but the moment he became more liability than asset, the Emperor was prepared to see him destroyed. The Emperor understood each Primarch's nature, their capabilities and their flaws, and he exploited all of it in service of his goals. When Lorgar needed to be corrected for spreading worship of the Emperor, the correction was not gentle, guidance, or private counsel. It was the public humiliation of Monarchia, an entire city burned to ash, while Lorgar and his word-bearers knelt in the ruins. This was not how a father disciplines a son. This was how a master punishes a disobedient servant, using public shame to enforce compliance. When Conrad Kurz's methods became too brutal, too excessive, even by the standards of the Great Crusade, the Emperor did not intervene with understanding or attempt to heal the damaged Primarch. He allowed the Night Haunter to continue his reign of terror, using him as an example of what happened to worlds that resisted, exploiting Kurz's madness as a weapon of psychological warfare. The Emperor understood that Kurz was broken, that his visions were driving him to atrocities, but that understanding did not translate to care or help. Kurz was a tool that still functioned, albeit in a darker way than originally intended. This treatment extended to how the Emperor deployed the Primarchs militarily. He did not keep them together, did not allow them to form the bonds of brotherhood that might have made them a unified force. Instead, he dispersed them across the galaxy, often assigning them to different expeditionary fleets, ensuring they spent years or even decades without seeing each other. This prevented them from forming alliances that might challenge his authority, kept them dependent on him as the central point of connection between them. When the Emperor did bring the Primarchs together, it was for specific purposes, calculated uses of their combined might for particular campaigns or objectives. The gatherings were opportunities for him to observe their interactions, to note which Primarchs were forming friendships or rivalries, to identify potential problems before they became threats. He was managing assets, not fostering family bonds. The Emperor also deliberately created tensions between the Primarchs. We know from Malcador, the Sigillite's testimony, that both he and the Emperor deliberately agitated the Primarchs, seeking to turn them against one another. The plan, according to Malcador, was that the resulting conflict would purge certain unmanageable Primarchs and their legions, just as the Thunder Warriors had been purged after the Unification Wars. This would leave humanity, not bioengineered superhumans, as the rulers of the galaxy. Whether this testimony was entirely truthful or partially a lie, as Malcador himself kept ambiguous, is less important than what it reveals about the Emperor's thinking. He saw the Primarchs as temporary necessities, beings needed for the conquest of the galaxy, but potentially dangerous once that conquest was complete. The idea of deliberately creating conflict between them to justify their eventual disposal was not alien to his thinking. It was consistent with how he had handled previous generations of super soldiers. This brings us to a crucial aspect of the Emperor's fear. He feared the Primarchs not just as individual threats, but as a collective power base that could rival his own. 20 transhuman generals, each commanding a legion of space marines numbering in the tens or hundreds of thousands, represented an army that could potentially challenge even the Emperor's authority. If they ever united against him, if they ever recognized him as their enemy rather than their master, the Imperium would be torn apart. The Emperor's solution was to ensure that unity could never form naturally. He kept them separated, encouraged their rivalries, exploited their differences. Leman Russ was encouraged to see himself as the Emperor's executioner, the one who would be sent against any Primarch who turned traitor. This created immediate tension between Russ and several of his brothers, particularly Magnus and the Lion. The Khan was allowed to remain distant from his brothers, isolated by his choice but also by the Emperor's acceptance of that isolation. Angron was never healed of the Butcher's nails, remaining a barely controlled berserker rather than the empathetic leader he might have been. Each of these decisions made tactical sense if the Primarchs were weapons to be used, but they were disastrous if the Primarchs were sons to be loved and nurtured. The Emperor chose the tactical approach every time, and that choice reflected his fundamental view of what the Primarchs were. But here is where the Emperor's cold rationality became his greatest weakness. By treating the Primarchs as tools, he failed to account for the fact that they were sentient beings capable of recognizing how they were being treated. They were intelligent enough to see the patterns, emotional enough to feel the absence of genuine affection, proud enough to resent being used and manipulated. The Emperor created beings with the capacity to understand what he was doing to them, and then he did it anyway, apparently believing that his power and their need for his approval would keep them compliant. This miscalculation stemmed from the Emperor's fundamental nature. He was not human in any normal sense. He was a being of such immense power and age that he had difficulty understanding the emotional needs of lesser beings, even when those beings were as powerful as the Primarchs. He did not understand that pride and dignity were not weaknesses to be exploited, but fundamental aspects of the Primarch's nature that, when wounded, would seek redress. The Primarchs needed to be valued, needed to be trusted with the truth, needed to feel that their service and sacrifice meant something beyond mere utility to the Emperor's plans. When they did not receive these things, when they were kept in ignorance, lied to, manipulated and used, that need did not disappear. It festered, creating wounds that chaos would later exploit with devastating effectiveness. The Emperor's fear of the Primarchs as potential rivals prevented him from treating them in the way that would have secured their genuine loyalty. He could not risk loving them, could not risk trusting them fully, could not risk allowing them to become true partners in his vision, rather than merely tools to execute it. That fear made him cold, manipulative, exploitative, and that treatment, in turn, created the very disloyalty he feared. Consider the tragic irony. The Emperor feared the Primarchs might one day turn against him, so he treated them in ways guaranteed to make them resentful and vulnerable to corruption. He feared they might rival his authority, so he denied them the full truth and trust that would have bound them to him more securely than any loyalty oath. He feared their power, so he managed them as threats to be contained rather than as assets to be maximized through genuine partnership. In trying to prevent the betrayal he feared, the Emperor created the conditions that made that betrayal inevitable. This is perhaps the greatest tragedy of the Imperium, that the most intelligent being humanity had ever produced could not see that treating weapons as people might have served his purposes better than treating people as weapons. The power that rivaled gods. To truly understand the Emperor's fear of the Primarchs, we must examine exactly what he had created. These were not merely enhanced humans, not even the standard transhuman space marines that would be created from their genetic template. The Primarchs were beings that approached divinity in their capabilities, and in several crucial ways, they possessed powers that could rival or even exceed those of the Emperor himself in specific domains. Start with their physical capabilities. The Primarchs stood between 10 and 12 feet tall, towering even over the Space Marines, who were already giants among men. Their strength was supernatural, capable of rending steel with their bare hands, crushing ceramite armor, wielding weapons that normal humans could barely lift. They could survive wounds that would kill even a Space Marine instantly, their enhanced biology and warp-infused nature giving them resilience that bordered on true immortality. Vulcan demonstrated this most clearly, being a perpetual who could regenerate from death itself, but all the Primarchs shared enhanced healing abilities that made them extraordinarily difficult to kill. But physical prowess was merely the foundation. The Primarchs were designed to be perfect generals, which meant they possessed intellects that could process tactical and strategic information at speeds and depths that normal humans could never achieve. They could see patterns in chaos, predict enemy movements, coordinate the actions of millions of troops across multiple theaters of war simultaneously. They were not just warriors, but supreme commanders, each one capable of managing the conquest of entire sectors of space. Their charisma was perhaps even more dangerous than their physical or intellectual capabilities. The Primarchs possessed an almost supernatural ability to inspire loyalty and devotion in those who served them. This was not merely the respect that skilled commanders earn through competence. It was something deeper, a warp-enhanced magnetism that made men willing to die at their command, that forged bonds of loyalty stronger than steel. This charisma extended beyond their own legions. Wherever the Primarchs went, they gathered followers, inspired cult-like devotion, became the centers of power structures that could rival even the Emperor's authority. This brings us to the psychic dimension of the Primarchs, and here is where the Emperor's fear becomes most justified. All the Primarchs were imbued with warp energy at their creation. This gave them varying degrees of psychic ability and made them inherently connected to the Imperium in ways that normal humans, even psychers, could never match. Some of this power was subtle, manifesting as preternatural awareness or resistance to psychic attacks. But in several Primarchs, the psychic abilities were overt and immensely powerful. Magnus the Red was the most obvious example. He was a psyker of such immense power that only the Emperor himself surpassed him. Magnus could breach the Imperial Palace's psychic defenses, could manifest physical forms across vast distances, could manipulate the warp with a level of skill and power that made him effectively a god of that realm. The Emperor himself said that he did not dare face one of the Chaos gods directly, yet Magnus possessed knowledge and capabilities in the warp that approached that level. This made Magnus simultaneously incredibly valuable and incredibly dangerous. But Magnus was far from the only psychically gifted Primarch. Sanguinius possessed the gift of foresight, able to see possible futures and prophetic visions of events yet to come. He saw his own death at Horus's hands long before it occurred, yet still chose to face that fate. Conrad Kersey shared this foresight, though his visions showed him only the darkest possible outcomes, driving him gradually into madness. Lorgar developed powerful psychic abilities, particularly after his fall to chaos, becoming a master of warp-based sorcery and demonic summoning. Korvax Korax possessed the ability to render himself effectively invisible, though whether this was true psychic invisibility or a form of mental manipulation that made others unable to perceive him remains debated. After his fall and transformation in the Eye of Terror, Korax gained the ability to transform into swarms of shadow ravens and other manifestations that suggested deep connection to warp energies. Fulgrim demonstrated the ability to overpower a demon, showing psychic will strong enough to resist possession by a powerful entity of chaos. Even Primarchs, not known for overt psychic abilities, demonstrated warp-connected powers. Alfarius and Omegon could change their size and appearance, potentially swap consciousness between bodies, and share a single soul, despite inhabiting two separate forms. The Khan and Russ had documented interactions with warp entities and demonstrated abilities that suggested deeper connections to that realm than they typically acknowledged. Leman Russ's psychic howl could shatter electronics and affect even powerful psychers like Magnus. The cumulative effect of these abilities was that the Emperor had created 20 beings who were not merely generals or warriors but potential god-kings in their own right. Each Primarch possessed enough charisma to inspire religious devotion, enough power to defeat armies, enough intelligence to govern sectors of space, and enough connection to the warp to potentially rival even the Emperor's own abilities in specific domains. This is what the Emperor feared most. Not simply that the Primarchs were powerful, but that they were powerful enough to become alternative centers of authority within the Imperium, rival claimants to the loyalty of humanity. If even one Primarch chose to set himself up as a god-king over a portion of the galaxy, he would have the capability to make it happen. If several Primarchs united in such an effort, they could potentially challenge even the Emperor's rule over Terra itself. Consider what Horus accomplished once he turned traitor. He managed to convince half the Space Marine legions and a significant portion of the Imperial army to follow him in rebellion. He nearly conquered Terra itself, coming within moments of killing the Emperor and claiming the Imperium for himself. This was possible because Horus possessed exactly the combination of charisma, military genius, and power that made him capable of rivaling the Emperor as a focus of loyalty and authority. But Horus was empowered by chaos during the heresy. In his natural state, before his corruption, He was powerful, but still clearly subordinate to the Emperor. What the Emperor feared was the possibility that even without Chaos's enhancement, the Primarchs could grow into rivals. Their power was not static. They could learn, grow, develop new abilities, and deeper understanding of their own capabilities. Given enough time, what might they become? We see hints of this potential in those Primarchs who survived into the modern era. When Lionel Johnson returned 10,000 years after his wounding, he demonstrated abilities and understanding that suggested he had continued to grow even while in stasis. Gilliman, upon his resurrection, showed capabilities that indicated the Primarchs were not fixed in their power, but could continue to evolve. Magnus, transformed into a demon Primarch, wields power that approaches that of the Chaos gods themselves in his domain. The Emperor created the Primarchs to be weapons, but he created them too well. They were not tools that could be simply picked up and put down. They were living beings of immense power who possessed their own wills, their own ambitions, their own capacity to grow beyond their intended purpose. This is the fundamental nature of the threat they represented. Moreover, the Primarchs commanded absolute loyalty from their legions. Each Space Marine legion numbered in the tens of thousands at minimum, with some like the Ultramarines growing to over 250,000 Astartes. These warriors were created from the Primarch's own genetic material and saw their Primarch as a father figure in ways even deeper than their loyalty to the Emperor. In many cases, a Space Marine's loyalty to his Primarch exceeded his loyalty to the Emperor, and the Primarchs knew this. This created a power structure within the Imperium that was potentially unstable. The Emperor ruled through the Primarchs, but the Primarchs ruled their legions absolutely. If a Primarch chose to rebel, his entire legion would likely follow him, as indeed happened during the heresy. The Emperor had created a system where his control over a significant portion of his military forces was mediated through beings powerful enough to potentially defy him. The Emperor's fear was thus both immediate and long-term. In the immediate sense, he feared that a Primarch might rebel at any moment, taking his legion with him and creating a schism in the Imperium that could tear it apart. This was not paranoia, but realistic assessment. The Primarchs were proud beings, conscious of their own power, and not all of them were content with simply following orders. Several of them, particularly Angron, Perturabo, and Curzé, showed clear signs of resentment toward the Emperor and the role he had forced upon them. In the long-term sense, the Emperor feared what the Primarchs might become if the Great Crusade succeeded and the galaxy was unified under Imperial rule. What would be the place of demigod generals in a time of peace? Would they be content to step aside and allow baseline humans to rule the Imperium? Would they accept the transition from military to civilian authority that the Emperor was clearly planning through the formation of the Council of Terror and the High Lords? The Thunder Warriors had served their purpose and been disposed of when they were no longer needed. The implication was clear that the Space Marines, and perhaps even the Primarchs, might face a similar fate once the Great Crusade was complete. The Emperor had built apartments for the Primarchs beneath the Imperial Palace, but these luxurious accommodations could as easily be seen as gilded cages as rewards for service. The idea that all 20 Primarchs could be corralled into underground apartments during peacetime was probably wishful thinking at best, and a containment strategy at worst. The Primarchs were too powerful, too independent, too capable of inspiring loyalty to simply retire quietly once their military function was complete. They would want roles commensurate with their abilities and their contribution to the Imperium's creation, but giving them such roles would mean accepting them as permanent fixtures of Imperial authority, rival, power centers that could challenge the Emperor's ultimate control. This was unacceptable to the Emperor's vision. His plan for humanity did not include rule by transhuman demigods. It included humanity transcending its current form through evolution into a psychic species, guided and protected from chaos by the Emperor's Webway project. The Primarchs were tools to achieve that vision, not inheritors of it. But tools this powerful don't easily accept being discarded when their use is done. So the Emperor feared them, these god weapons he had created. He feared their power, their independence, their charisma, their potential to grow beyond his control. And that fear shaped every interaction, every decision, every choice he made regarding their deployment and management. He needed them, but he also needed to contain them, to ensure they never realized the full extent of their own power, or united in recognition that they did not need him as much as he needed them. The scattering, accident, attack, or calculated design. Few events in Imperial history are as pivotal or as mysterious as the scattering of the Primarchs. According to the official narrative, the 20 infant Primarchs were stolen from the Emperor's gene laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains by the Chaos Gods, who breached even the most powerful defenses the Emperor could create and cast the Primarchs through the warp to distant worlds across the galaxy. This theft was a catastrophic setback to the Emperor's plans, depriving him of the generals he needed and forcing him to proceed with the Great Crusade using inferior space marines created from the Primarchs' genetic material while he searched for his lost sons. This is the story the Imperium tells. But like so many Imperial narratives, it may not be the whole truth. Evidence suggests a far more disturbing possibility, that the scattering was not a theft by the Chaos Gods, but a deliberate act by the Emperor himself, or at the very least, something he allowed to happen because it served his purposes better than raising 20 fully realized Primarchs under his direct supervision on Terra. Consider first the multiple contradictory accounts of how the scattering actually occurred. Some sources claim the Chaos Gods simply breached the Emperor's defenses and stole the Primarchs in their gestation pods. Others suggest that the perpetual Erda, who had worked with the Emperor on the Primarch project and contributed her own genetic material to their creation, became horrified by the Emperor's plans for her children and used her own powers to create the warp vortex that scattered them. Still other accounts, derived from visions shown to wordbearers who traveled back in time through the warp, suggest that servants of chaos physically destroyed the Geller field generators protecting the gene vaults, allowing warp energies to pour in and carry the infant Primarchs away. But beneath all these contradictory accounts lies a common thread. Whether it was Erda acting out of maternal horror, Chaos servants destroying the defenses, or the Chaos Gods themselves exerting their power, the Emperor's response to the scattering was remarkably measured. He did not rage against those responsible. He did not launch an immediate campaign of vengeance. Instead, he adapted his plans, continuing to pursue his vision for the Imperium, while methodically searching for and recovering his lost sons over the course of decades. This response seems strange, unless we consider that the scattering was not the disaster it appeared to be, but rather a development the Emperor had anticipated or even orchestrated. Several Primarchs themselves came to suspect this. Conrad Kurze, Robert Guilliman, and Sanguinius all expressed beliefs that the scattering had been part of the Emperor's plan all along, that they had been deliberately cast to the worlds where they landed to be shaped by experiences he could not or would not provide under his direct supervision. The evidence supporting this theory is compelling. First, consider the timing and location of the Emperor's discoveries of the Primarchs. In nearly every case, he arrived at a pivotal moment in the Primarch's life, at exactly the point where the Primarch had risen to power on his world and was ready to take command of a legion. The Khan was found just after unifying the tribes of Chagoris. Mortarion was discovered as he prepared to challenge the overlord of Barbarous. Angron was located at the moment of his final stand with his slave army. Fulgrim had just united the factories of Chemos under his leadership. These moments of discovery were too perfectly timed to be coincidence. Either the Emperor possessed foreknowledge of exactly when each Primarch would reach the appropriate stage of development, or he had some means of observing them throughout their growth, and chose his moment of intervention carefully. Both possibilities suggest a level of control and planning inconsistent with the narrative of desperate search for stolen sons. Second, consider the worlds themselves and how perfectly they match the nature of each Primarch. Fenris, a death world of ice and monsters, created Leman Russ, the savage warrior and executioner. Nostramo, a crime-ridden nightmare world of eternal darkness, forged Konrad Kurz, the judge and bringer of terror. Baal's radioactive wastelands and vampire-haunted wastes created Sanguinius, angel of death and nobility. The Forge world, where Ferrus Manus landed, gave him his liquid metal hands and turned him into the master craftsman. Nuceria's gladiatorial pits created Angron's skill at combat, even if the butcher's nails twisted what he might have been. Each Primarch's homeworld seemed almost designed to amplify certain traits built into their genetic template. The worlds were not random destinations, but perfect crucibles for creating specific types of warriors and leaders. This suggests planning beyond the Chaos Gods, simple desire to corrupt the Emperor's creations. It suggests that the scattering was meant to happen, that the worlds were chosen destinations rather than random impact sites. Leman Russ himself was confronted with this possibility during a vision quest. A warp entity, possibly a demon though not necessarily hostile, showed him that the Primarch's scattering was deliberate, that the Emperor had flung them wide across the galaxy. The entity suggested that the scattering served the Emperor's purposes by ensuring the Primarchs would be shaped by adversity rather than luxury, forged by suffering rather than nurtured in safety. This interpretation makes disturbing sense when we consider the Emperor's fundamental view of the Primarchs as weapons rather than sons. A weapon kept in a display case never develops the edge and resilience of one that has been used and tested in battle. By allowing or engineering the Primarchs to be scattered to harsh worlds, the Emperor ensured they would be hardened by experience, shaped by necessity, turned into the kinds of leaders who could conquer a galaxy rather than merely administrative skills to govern one. Consider what each Primarch gained from his world that he would not have learned on Terra under the Emperor's supervision. The Lion learned the craft of warfare against the monsters of Caliban's forests, developing strategic thinking that would make him one of the greatest tacticians among his brothers. Fulgrim learned the art of perfection through necessity on Chemos, where any inefficiency meant death. The Khan learned the value of speed and mobility on the plains of Chagoris. Rogel Dawn learned fortification and defense on Inwit. Sanguinius learned to lead through nobility and self-sacrifice on Baal. Even the darker lessons were valuable to the Emperor's purposes. Angron learned to fight through impossible odds and to inspire others to suicidal courage. Kurzi learned to use terror as a weapon and to be the harsh judge that mercy would not allow. Mortarion learned to hate tyrants and rulers who claimed to know better than those they governed. Perturabo learned to endure suffering and to complete objectives regardless of cost. These were not lessons the Emperor could have taught on Terra. These were lessons that required suffering, hardship, loss, and the crucible of actual necessity rather than mere training. By scattering the Primarchs, whether deliberately or by allowing it to happen, the Emperor ensured they would possess not just the capabilities he had designed into them, but the experiences that would make them effective generals rather than merely powerful warriors. But there is an even darker possibility. What if the scattering was not just about hardening the Primarchs, but about preventing them from uniting under anyone's leadership, including potentially against the Emperor himself? 20 Primarchs raised together on Terra would have formed bonds of brotherhood from childhood. They would have known each other intimately, understood each other's strengths and weaknesses, potentially developed a sense of collective identity and purpose that was independent of the Emperor's will. By scattering them and ensuring they grew up separately, each shaped by a different world and different experiences, the Emperor guaranteed they would be strangers to each other when finally brought together. They would have little common ground beyond their genetic heritage and their service to the Emperor. Their worldviews would be so different, their personalities so shaped by vastly different circumstances that natural unity between them would be difficult, if not impossible. This served the Emperor's purposes perfectly. Divided Primarchs could be managed individually. They could be played against each other, their rivalries encouraged, their alliances limited. They would compete for the Emperor's favor, rather than potentially uniting to question his decisions. The scattering, far from being a disaster, may have been the best thing that could have happened from the Emperor's perspective, even if it delayed his plans by decades. There's also the question of what happened during the scattering itself. Several Primarchs manifested unusual abilities or underwent transformation during their journey through the warp. Magnus's physical form was changed, requiring intervention to stabilize. Conrad Kersey gained his precognitive visions. Sanguinius acquired his wings. These changes suggest that the Primarch's passage through the warp was not simply transportation, but transformation, that they were altered by their exposure to that realm in ways that the Emperor may have anticipated or even desired. The Chaos Gods certainly tampered with the Primarchs during the scattering, planting seeds of corruption that would later be exploited. But what if the Emperor knew this would happen and accepted it as the price of achieving other goals? What if he calculated that the benefits of scattered, experience-hardened Primarchs outweighed the risk of chaos influence, particularly if he could later identify and eliminate those Primarchs who had been too corrupted to remain useful? This brings us to the mystery of the lost Primarchs, the 2nd and 11th, who were erased from Imperial records so thoroughly that even their names are unknown. These Primarchs were found, given command of their legions, and then something happened that caused the Emperor to order their complete removal from history. Their legions were disbanded, with some evidence suggesting their surviving Space Marines were integrated into other legions, particularly the Ultramarines. What did these lost Primarchs do that warranted such complete erasure? The answer is never explicitly stated, but hints suggest it involved either refusing the Emperor's authority or demonstrating such instability that they threatened the success of the Great Crusade. In other words, they were experiments that failed, Primarchs whose scattering and development produced results the Emperor found unacceptable. Rather than trying to redeem them, he simply eliminated them and erased all evidence of their existence. This suggests that the scattering was, in fact, a test, a way for the Emperor to identify which Primarchs were truly useful, which had been shaped by their experiences into weapons he could effectively wield, and which had been damaged or corrupted beyond utility. The lost Primarchs failed that test and were purged. The others passed and were integrated into the Great Crusade, though with varying degrees of success and stability. From this perspective, the scattering was not an attack or an accident, but a calculated strategy that served multiple purposes. It hardened the Primarchs through adversity. It prevented them from forming unified bonds that might challenge the Emperor's authority. It tested their resilience and identified which ones were too damaged or independent to be useful. And it gave the Emperor a convenient explanation for any problems that arose later. If a Primarch proved difficult or rebellious, it could always be blamed on the trauma of the scattering and their harsh upbringings, rather than on any fundamental flaw in their design or in the Emperor's management of them. The Emperor's fear of the Primarchs may have been what motivated the scattering in the first place. Rather than raising 20 demigods under his supervision, beings who would grow up understanding their full power and potentially resenting their subordinate status, he cast them to the winds and let harsh reality break them, forge them, and most importantly, isolate them from each other. When he finally gathered them back together, they would be strangers rather than brothers, tools rather than sons, separated by their different experiences and unable to unite against him, even if they wanted to. If this theory is correct, then the Emperor's fear of the Primarchs led him to engineer their suffering from the moment of their creation. He created them with chaos-tainted power, scattered them to harsh worlds, allowed them to be shaped by trauma and hardship, and then retrieved them one by one to serve his purposes. Every moment of pain, every loss, every scar they carried from their upbringings was part of his plan, accepted as necessary to create tools hard enough to conquer a galaxy, but damaged enough never to threaten his ultimate control. This is perhaps the darkest aspect of the Emperor's relationship with the Primarchs. Not that he failed to love them, but that he may have deliberately arranged their suffering because suffering made them more useful weapons and less dangerous rivals. The scattering was not a theft by the Chaos Gods, but a strategy by a being so focused on his ultimate goal that he was willing to sacrifice even his own creation's happiness and sanity to achieve it. Control through ignorance, the web of lies that bound them. One of the most consequential aspects of the Emperor's fear regarding the Primarchs was his decision to keep them ignorant of crucial information, particularly regarding the nature of chaos and the warp. This policy of deliberate ignorance was not an oversight or a mistake. It was a calculated strategy born from the Emperor's recognition that knowledge was power, and he dared not give the Primarchs the kind of knowledge that might allow them to rival or challenge him. The Emperor's lies to the Primarchs were not simple falsehoods, but carefully constructed narratives designed to shape how the Primarchs understood reality and their place in it. The most significant of these lies concerned the very forces that had been used to create them, and that would ultimately corrupt half of them. The Emperor told the Primarchs almost nothing about the true nature of chaos, about the four great powers of the warp, or about the dangers they would face from entities that could corrupt even beings as powerful as they were. This secrecy was not because the Emperor thought the Primarchs too weak-minded to handle such knowledge. He knew they were stronger-willed than any normal humans. The problem was that they were also powerful enough to potentially use such knowledge in ways he could not control. If the Primarchs understood the true nature of chaos, they might seek to bargain with those powers as the Emperor himself had done on Molech. They might develop their own relationships with warp entities, pursue their own agendas regarding humanity's evolution and the Imperium's influence. The Emperor feared what the Primarchs might become if they fully understood the nature of the power that flowed through them. He had bargained with the Chaos Gods to create the Primarchs, imbuing them with warp energy that made them susceptible to corruption, but also potentially capable of wielding that same energy against its source. A Primarch who truly understood his own nature and the nature of chaos might be able to resist corruption more effectively than one kept in ignorance, but he might also be able to use chaos power deliberately, making choices about when and how to engage with those forces, rather than simply being protected from them. Magnus the Red was the exception, the only Primarch the Emperor trusted with significant knowledge about the warp and chaos. This was necessary because Magnus was intended to serve a specific purpose in the Emperor's Webway project. He was meant to eventually take the Emperor's place on the Golden Throne, using his immense psychic power to hold close the portal to the Webway and protect it from demonic incursion. To fulfill this role, Magnus needed to understand the nature of the warp and the entities within it far more deeply than his brothers. But even Magnus was not told everything. The Emperor revealed enough to make Magnus useful, but held back the full truth about his own bargain with chaos, about the specific nature of the four great powers, about the deeper plans he had for humanity's evolution. Magnus learned much through his own studies and explorations of the warp, but the Emperor did not volunteer information, even to his most psychically gifted son. This selective sharing of knowledge was itself a form of control, giving Magnus just enough truth to be valuable while keeping him dependent on the Emperor for deeper understanding. For the other Primarchs, the Emperor's policy was almost complete suppression of information about chaos. They knew that dangerous entities existed in the warp, that demons could possess psychers, that sorcery was forbidden. But they did not understand why. They were told that faith and superstition were enemies of progress, that there were no gods, that the creatures in the warp were simply dangerous aliens from another dimension. They were not told that these entities called themselves gods, that they fed on human emotions and worship, that they had the power to corrupt even beings as mighty as Primarchs. This ignorance made the Primarchs far more vulnerable to chaos corruption than they needed to be. When Horus encountered the powers of chaos on Davin, he did not recognize what they truly were. He saw beings offering him power and vindication, but did not understand the price they would exact or the transformation they would force upon him. When Lorga sought spiritual truth after the humiliation of Monarchia, he had no framework for understanding that the entities offering him answers were malevolent powers that would turn him against everything he had once held dear. Had the Primarchs been educated about chaos, about how it worked and what it wanted, they would have been better equipped to resist its corruption. But that education would have required the Emperor to admit that such powers existed on a level that potentially rivaled his own, that he had bargained with them, that much of his own power derived from dealing with the very forces he now told them did not exist as gods. Such admissions would have undermined the Emperor's authority and potentially encouraged the Primarchs to seek their own accommodations with chaos. The Emperor feared that giving the Primarchs knowledge about chaos would be like giving them access to a weapon they could potentially use against him. If they understood the true nature of the warp and their own connection to it, if they knew that the power of belief and worship could sustain warp entities and potentially create new ones, if they understood that the Emperor himself had bargained with chaos, they might begin to ask dangerous questions. Why should they not make similar bargains? Why should they not seek to harness chaos power for their own purposes? Why should they accept the Emperor's authority when he himself had treated with the very entities he forbade them from acknowledging? This brings us to the Council of Nicaea, one of the most consequential decisions of the Great Crusade and one directly motivated by the Emperor's fear of the Primarchs wielding powers he could not fully control. The issue before the council was whether Space Marine legions should be allowed to maintain librarius departments, psychically gifted Marines who used their abilities to support their brothers in combat. Some Primarchs, particularly Magnus and Sanguinius, argued that these abilities were necessary and that with proper training and discipline, they could be used safely. Others, particularly Mortarion and Russ, argued that any use of psychic powers was dangerously close to the sorcery practiced by chaos cultists and should be forbidden. The Emperor's decision was clear and final. He banned the use of all psychic powers except those of navigators and astropaths who were essential to the Imperium's function. No more librarians, no more psychic investigation into the warp, no more attempts to understand or harness the powers of the Imperium. The Primarchs were to focus on physical conquest and leave the realm of psychic power to the Emperor alone. This decision was framed as protection, a safeguard against corruption by chaos. But it was also an assertion of control. The Emperor was declaring that he alone would determine who could use psychic abilities and how. The Primarchs would not be allowed to develop their own corps of psychically empowered warriors, would not be permitted to explore the warp independently, would not have access to the kind of knowledge and capability that might allow them to rival the Emperor's own mastery of that realm. Magnus, in particular, was humiliated by this decision. His entire legion was built around the controlled use of psychic power, and the Emperor's edict at Nicaea essentially declared that everything Magnus had accomplished was wrong and dangerous. The Emperor, who had entrusted Magnus with secrets about the warp, now publicly condemned the Primarch for using knowledge the Emperor himself had provided. This betrayal, for it was nothing less, planted seeds of resentment that chaos would later exploit. But beyond the specific case of Magnus, the Edict of Nicaea demonstrated the Emperor's fundamental approach to managing the Primarchs. He would give them power and responsibility, but only as much as he could control. He would trust them with command of legions, but not with knowledge that might make them independent actors. He would use their capabilities, but constrain their ability to grow beyond the roles he had defined for them. This policy of control through ignorance extended to other crucial matters. The Emperor did not share his plans for the Webway project with the Primarchs, even though that project was the ultimate goal toward which the entire Great Crusade was directed. He did not tell them that the conquest of the galaxy was merely the first stage of his plan, that the true objective was to cut humanity off from the warp entirely and guide the species' evolution into something new. He did not explain why he was withdrawing from the Great Crusade at its height to return to Terra, leaving the Primarchs to wonder if he had abandoned them or if their service was no longer valued. Each of these secrets created gaps in the Primarchs' understanding, spaces where doubt could grow. When Horus felt abandoned by the Emperor's withdrawal to Terra, he had no framework for understanding why it was necessary. When Magnus tried to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption, he used the very sorcery the Emperor had forbidden, breaking the Emperor's trust at the moment when that trust was most crucial. When Lorgar sought spiritual meaning after Monarchia, he had nowhere to turn, except to the very forces the Emperor had hidden from him. The Emperor's fear of what the Primarchs might do with knowledge led him to keep them ignorant, but that ignorance made them vulnerable to manipulation by chaos. The Chaos Gods did not need to lie to the Primarchs. They simply needed to tell them truths the Emperor had concealed. They revealed that gods did exist in the warp. They explained that the Emperor had bargained with those very gods. They showed that power could be gained through worship and devotion, that ascension was possible, that the Emperor's vision of secular enlightenment was a lie designed to keep others from achieving the power he himself possessed. These revelations were devastating precisely because they were true, or at least contained enough truth to be persuasive. The Primarchs discovered that the being they had trusted as father and master had been lying to them about fundamental aspects of reality. The Emperor, who claimed there were no gods, had himself treated with powers that demanded worship. The Emperor, who forbade sorcery, had used it to create the Primarchs themselves. The Emperor, who preached unity and brotherhood, had deliberately kept his sons in ignorance and played them against each other. The tragedy is that the Emperor's fears about knowledge were not entirely wrong. If the Primarchs had full knowledge of chaos and the warp, some of them might have sought to make their own bargains with those powers. Magnus's fate suggests that even with knowledge and the best intentions, dealing with chaos inevitably leads to corruption. Lorgar, once he learned the truth, embraced chaos willingly and became its greatest champion among the Primarchs. But the Emperor's solution was not better. By keeping the Primarchs ignorant, he ensured they would be unprepared when chaos finally did reach them. They had no framework for resistance, no understanding of the strategies chaos would use, no training in how to recognize and reject corruption. They were weapons sent into battle without knowledge of their enemy, and that ignorance cost half of them their souls and the Imperium half its strength. The Emperor's fear led him to try to control the Primarchs through information management, but that control was illusory. He could not keep chaos secret forever. The galaxy was full of cultists, demons, and warp-corrupted worlds. Eventually, every Primarch would encounter these forces and have to make sense of them without the guidance that proper education would have provided. By choosing to keep them ignorant, the Emperor ensured that when they finally learned the truth, it would be from chaos itself, framed in ways designed to turn them against the Emperor. This was perhaps the most catastrophic failure of judgment in the Emperor's long existence. His fear of what the Primarchs might do with knowledge led him to deprive them of the one thing that might have saved them from corruption. He was so concerned about being rivaled or challenged that he blinded his own sons to the greatest threat they would face, and in doing so, he created the very betrayal he feared. Half the Primarchs fell to chaos, not because they were weak, but because they were unprepared. And they were unprepared because the Emperor's fear prevented him from giving them the knowledge they needed to resist. The Emperor feared the power that knowledge would give the Primarchs, feared they might use that knowledge to rival his authority, or pursue their own agendas regarding chaos and the warp. That fear was not unfounded, but acting on it destroyed the Imperium more effectively than any chaos plot could have. The web of lies the Emperor wove to bind the Primarchs became chains that dragged them into damnation, and the Emperor himself had forged every link. The Thunder Warrior. Precedent, a fate foreshadowed. To truly understand why the Emperor feared the Primarchs, and what he might have planned for them after the Great Crusade's completion, we must look to the fate of their predecessors. Before the Space Marines, before the Primarchs, there were the Thunder Warriors, the Emperor's first attempt at creating transhuman soldiers to conquer Terra during the Unification Wars. These warriors served their purpose magnificently, but once that purpose was fulfilled, they were disposed of with cold calculation that should make us question what the Emperor intended for his later creations. The Thunder Warriors were massive, powerful warriors, each one a gene-forged killing machine designed to fight and win in the barbaric wars that raged across Terra during the Age of Strife. They were stronger and more resilient than normal humans, capable of feats that would later be surpassed by Space Marines, but which at the time represented the pinnacle of the Emperor's genetic engineering. They followed the Emperor with fanatical devotion, seeing him as their creator and master, much as the Space Marines and Primarchs would later do. But the Thunder Warriors had a fatal flaw, though not one that made them less effective as soldiers. Their genetic enhancement was unstable. They suffered from cellular degradation, their bodies slowly breaking down under the strain of their augmented capabilities. They were short-lived by design or by accident, depending on which source you believe, but the effect was the same. The Thunder Warriors were powerful, but temporary, weapons that would burn brightly and then burn out. The Emperor could have attempted to fix this flaw, to stabilize the Thunder Warriors' genetics and give them longer lifespans. He had the knowledge and capability to do so, as evidenced by his later work creating the Space Marines with their more stable enhancements. Instead, he made a different choice. Once Terra was unified under his rule, once the Thunder Warriors had served their purpose of conquering the warlords and bringing order to humanity's birthworld, he had them eliminated. The betrayal was methodical and thorough. The Thunder Warriors were gathered for what they thought would be a celebration of their victory. Instead, they were systematically slaughtered by the forces that would replace them, the newly created Space Marines and the Custodian Guard. The Thunder Warriors, who had fought and bled for the Emperor's vision, were killed by their successors as their reward for loyal service. Only a handful survived, scattered remnants who went into hiding, bitter and betrayed. One such survivor, Aric Taranis, the last of the Thunder Warriors, lived for centuries after the massacre, carrying his rage and his knowledge of what the Emperor had done. Another, Ushatan, the Thunder Warrior Primarch from the Unification Wars, also survived to see the Imperium rise. These survivors served as living witnesses to the Emperor's willingness to dispose of his tools once they had outlived their usefulness, even when those tools were sentient beings who had shown nothing but loyalty. The reasons the Emperor gave, when any were given at all, focused on the Thunder Warriors' genetic instability and their unsuitability for the more complex tasks of building an interstellar empire versus simply conquering a world. They were too brutal, too unstable, too tied to the savage warfare of the Unification Wars to adapt to the more refined needs of the Great Crusade. Better to replace them with the superior Space Marines than to try to retrain warriors built for a specific type of conflict. But these were rationalizations. The truth was simpler and more chilling. The Thunder Warriors represented a concentration of military power that the Emperor no longer needed and no longer wanted to maintain. They were loyal to him personally, but they were also independent warriors with their own culture and sense of identity. Once Terra was unified, their usefulness ended, but the threat they potentially represented did not. A force of transhuman warriors who had known nothing but war might not adapt well to peacetime. They might become restless, might seek new conflicts, might even turn their weapons against the society they were meant to protect. Rather than deal with these potential problems, the Emperor simply eliminated them. He replaced them with a superior generation of warriors, the Space Marines, who were more stable and better suited to the tasks ahead. The Thunder Warriors' disposal was framed as progress, as upgrading to better tools, but it was also a demonstration of the Emperor's fundamental approach to resources that had outlived their utility. This precedent casts a dark shadow over the fate that might have awaited the Primarchs and their Space Marine legions once the Great Crusade was complete. If the Emperor was willing to betray and destroy the Thunder Warriors who had won him terror, what would he do with the Space Marines and Primarchs once they had won him the galaxy? The pattern suggested that these newer generations of warriors might face a similar fate, disposed of once they had served their purpose, and replaced by whatever the Emperor deemed more suitable for the next phase of his plan. Malcador, the Sigillite's testimony, provides disturbing support for this theory. According to the Sigillite, both he and the Emperor had deliberately agitated the Primarchs, seeking to turn them against one another. The plan, as Malcador described it, was that the resulting conflict would purge certain unmanageable Primarchs and their legions, just as the Thunder Warriors had been purged after the Unification Wars. This would leave humanity not bioengineered superhumans as the rulers of the galaxy once the military phase of the Imperium's establishment was complete. Whether Malcador was telling the full truth or offering a partial lie to serve some other purpose, his testimony reveals that the Emperor had at least considered engineering a conflict that would eliminate problematic Primarchs. The idea was not alien to his thinking. It was consistent with his past actions and his fundamental view of the Primarchs as tools rather than sons. If some of those tools proved unsuitable or dangerous, the solution was to dispose of them, using whatever method was most expedient. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing piece of evidence: the Emperor's plan for the Primarchs after the Great Crusade. Unknown to the Primarchs themselves, a vast underground cavern deep beneath the Imperial Palace had been prepared as residential quarters for them. 20 spacious apartments overlooked a large subterranean lake, each designed for habitation by a being of the Primarch's massive proportions. At least one Primarch, Corvus Corax, briefly stayed in his designated apartment during a visit to Terra. On the surface, this sounds like thoughtful preparation for the Primarch's comfort and well-being after the wars were won. But consider the implications. These apartments were underground, hidden away from the surface, isolated from the centers of power and the populations the Primarchs had conquered. The idea that all 20 Primarchs could be corralled into these residential quarters during an extended period of peace was probably wishful thinking on the Emperor's part. But it was also revealing of his intentions. He planned to separate the Primarchs from their legions, from their roles as conquerors and generals, from the sources of their power and influence. These apartments were not rewards. They were gilded cages, comfortable prisons where the Primarchs could be monitored and contained while the Emperor restructured the Imperium according to his vision. Away from their legions, cut off from military authority, the Primarchs would have been neutered as political forces. They would have been honored guests with no real power, retired generals living on past glories, while others made the decisions about the Imperium's future. And what of their legions? The Space Marines numbered in the hundreds of thousands across all 20 legions. They were designed for war, created to fight and conquer. What place would they have in a unified, peaceful Imperium? The Emperor had already begun transitioning power to civilian authorities through the Council of Terror and the High Lords, reducing the military's influence over imperial governance. This transition suggested that the Space Marines, like the Thunder Warriors before them, might be seen as temporary necessities rather than permanent fixtures of imperial society. Several Primarchs understood this. Robert Guilliman planned for the Ultramarines to transition from warriors to administrators, teaching his legion skills that would allow them to serve the Imperium in peacetime roles. He saw the end of the Great Crusade coming and prepared his sons for a different kind of service. But not all Primarchs were as forward-thinking or as willing to accept a diminished role for their legions. What would become of Primarchs like Angron, whose World Eaters knew nothing but blood and slaughter? What future was there for the Night Lords under Conrad Kurz, who maintained order through terror and mass murder? Could the Space Wolves truly transition from the Emperor's executioners to peaceful defenders? Would the Iron Warriors, bitter and resentful after decades of the hardest, most thankless campaigns, except being stood down after the conquests were complete. The emperor had no good answers to these questions, or rather, he had one answer that he had used before: disposal. The problematic Primarchs and their legions could be eliminated through engineered conflicts, through purges, through whatever means proved necessary. The more adaptable Primarchs might be allowed to survive in reduced roles, kept under observation in their underground apartments, perhaps occasionally consulted, but never allowed to return to positions of real authority. This is what the emperor feared most about the Primarchs in the long term, not that they would rebel during the Great Crusade, though that fear was also present, but that they would refuse to be set aside once the conquests were complete. The Primarchs were too powerful, too charismatic, too capable to simply retire quietly. They would demand roles commensurate with their contributions and their abilities. They would become alternative centers of authority within the Imperium, rival power bases that could challenge the Emperor's ultimate control. The Thunder Warrior precedent showed that the Emperor was willing to eliminate his own creations when they threatened his plans, or had outlived their usefulness. The preparations made for the Primarch's retirement showed that he had thought about what would happen to them after the wars ended. The testimony from Malcador suggested that he had considered engineering conflicts to purge problematic elements. All of this points to a disturbing conclusion. The Emperor had no intention of allowing the Primarchs to maintain their power and influence once the Great Crusade was complete. This fear, the Primarchs' fear of their own obsolescence and disposal, was not paranoia, but realistic assessment of their situation. They were weapons created for a specific purpose, and once that purpose was achieved, weapons are typically stored away, or, if they're too dangerous to store, destroyed. The Emperor had demonstrated with the Thunder Warriors that he was capable of such ruthless calculation. The Primarchs had every reason to fear that a similar fate awaited them. The bitter irony is that this fear of disposal may have contributed to the Horus heresy itself. When Chaos whispered to the Primarchs about the Emperor's true intentions, when it suggested that he planned to discard them once they were no longer useful, it was telling a truth that resonated with what some Primarchs had already begun to suspect. The Emperor's cold treatment of them, his refusal to share his plans or trust them with full knowledge, his obvious preparations for a post-Crusade Imperium that seemed to have little place for transhuman warriors. All of these things suggested that Chaos might be right about the Emperor's ultimate intentions. The Emperor feared the Primarchs enough to plan for their eventual containment or elimination. The Primarchs feared the Emperor enough to believe he would actually carry out such plans. This mutual fear, this recognition that their interests might ultimately diverge despite their current alliance, poisoned the relationship and created the conditions for betrayal. The Thunder Warriors had trusted the Emperor and been slaughtered for their loyalty. The Primarchs, some of them at least, were determined not to make the same mistake. In trying to prepare for the day when the Primarchs would no longer be useful, in making arrangements to contain or eliminate them when that day came, the Emperor revealed that he saw them as temporary necessities rather than permanent partners in his vision for humanity. That revelation, whether consciously understood or intuitively felt, broke something fundamental in the relationship. It showed that the Emperor's fear of the Primarchs was ultimately more important to him than their loyalty, and that knowledge made rebellion not just possible, but, in the minds of those who turned traitor, necessary for their very survival. The individual threats, Primarchs, who frightened him most. While the Emperor feared all the Primarchs as potential threats to his control, certain individuals represented dangers that went beyond the standard concerns about their power and independence. These Primarchs, through their specific capabilities, personalities, or circumstances, posed unique challenges to the Emperor's authority and his plans for humanity. Understanding which Primarchs the Emperor feared most reveals much about what he valued and what he saw as genuine threats to his vision. Magnus the Red stands at the apex of the Emperor's fears, the Primarch, who represented both the greatest promise and the greatest danger. Magnus was created to serve a specific, crucial purpose in the Emperor's plans. He was meant to take the Emperor's place on the Golden Throne, using his immense psychic power to maintain the human webway and protect it from demonic incursion. This would allow the Emperor to be free to pursue the next stages of his plan for humanity's evolution. Magnus was, in essence, irreplaceable. No other Primarch possessed the psychic might necessary for this role, but Magnus's very power made him terrifying. He was the second most powerful Psyker in the galaxy, surpassed only by the Emperor himself. His knowledge of the warp was profound, his ability to manipulate its energies unmatched among the Primarchs. This made him incredibly valuable, but also incredibly dangerous. Magnus possessed knowledge and capabilities that approached the Emperor's own in the psychic realm. If Magnus chose to oppose the Emperor, if he turned his knowledge and power against his creator, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Emperor's fear of Magnus was realized when the Primarch attempted to warn him about Horus's corruption. Magnus used the forbidden sorcery that had been banned at the Council of Nicaea, and in doing so, he accidentally shattered the psychic wards, protecting the Emperor's webway project. The breach Magnus created allowed demonic forces to pour into the human section of the webway, forcing the Emperor to abandon the Great Crusade and spend the rest of the heresy holding the portal closed to prevent Terra itself from being overrun by daemons. Whether this was truly an accident, or whether Magnus, in his desperation to warn the Emperor, simply did not care about the consequences of his action, the result was the same. The most psychically gifted Primarch, the one the Emperor had most trusted with knowledge of the warp, had destroyed the Emperor's most important project and doomed humanity to continued reliance on warp travel and all its dangers. Magnus had proven that the Emperor's fears about him were justified, that a Primarch with that much knowledge and power could, even with the best intentions, cause irreparable harm to the Emperor's plans. Horus Lupercal represented a different kind of threat, one perhaps even more dangerous than Magnus because it was political rather than mystical. Horus was the Emperor's war master, the Primarch chosen to command all the others during the Great Crusade. He was charismatic beyond even the usual Primarch standard, capable of inspiring absolute loyalty in his brothers and in the troops who served under him. His political and military genius made him irreplaceable as the supreme commander of Imperial forces. But these same qualities made Horus a potential rival for the Emperor's authority. Horus commanded not just his own legion, but, through his role as war master, had authority over all the others. He was the being that the Primarchs looked to for leadership when the Emperor was not present. The troops loved him, the Primarchs respected him, and the entire military apparatus of the Imperium ran through his command structure. If Horus chose to use that position against the Emperor, he could potentially turn the entire military might of the Imperium to his own purposes. This is exactly what happened during the heresy. When Horus fell to chaos and declared his rebellion, half the Space Marine legions followed him. Not because they worshipped chaos, not initially at least, but because they followed Horus. Their loyalty to the War Master exceeded their loyalty to the Emperor, and that loyalty nearly cost the Emperor everything. The Emperor had created the position of War Master out of necessity, needing someone to coordinate the Great Crusade while he returned to Terra to work on the Webway project. But in doing so, he had created a rival center of authority, a being who commanded loyalties that even the Emperor could not completely control. The Emperor must have recognized this danger even before Horus's fall. The War Master held too much power, commanded too much loyalty, and had too much independent authority. But the Great Crusade required such a position, required someone the Primarchs would follow without the Emperor's constant presence. The Emperor had chosen Horus because he was the best candidate, the most capable, and the most loyal. But that choice revealed the Emperor's fear. Even his most trusted son, the one he believed completely devoted to his cause, represented a potential threat that could destroy everything he had built. Lorgar Aurelian posed a threat of an entirely different nature. one that struck at the heart of the Emperor's vision for humanity. Lorgar was the most spiritual of the Primarchs, driven by a need to find meaning and purpose beyond mere conquest. He wanted to worship something greater than himself, to find transcendent truth in a universe the Emperor claimed was devoid of gods. This spiritual hunger made Lorgar vulnerable to chaos, but it also made him dangerous to the Emperor's project of secular rationalism. The Emperor's vision for humanity explicitly rejected religion and superstition. The imperial truth held that there were no gods, that the universe operated according to natural laws that could be understood and mastered through reason and science. This ideology was necessary for the Emperor's plans because worship and faith fed the chaos gods, strengthening them and making them more dangerous. By denying the existence of gods and suppressing religious expression, the Emperor hoped to starve chaos of the emotional energy it needed to threaten humanity. But Lorgar refused to accept this. He saw the Emperor himself as divine, worthy of worship as a god. He spread this belief through the worlds his word-bearers conquered, building temples and establishing cults of Emperor worship that directly contradicted the imperial truth. The Emperor's response was brutal. He had the city of Monarchia, Lorgar's masterpiece of devotional architecture, burned to ash. He forced Lorgar and the word-bearers to kneel in the ruins, while he reprimanded them for their failure to adhere to the imperial truth. But the Emperor's fear of Lorgar went deeper than simple disobedience. Lorgar represented the possibility that humans would not accept a godless universe, that they would continue to seek transcendent meaning and purpose, even when told such things did not exist. If Lorgar could not be broken of his spiritual tendencies, if his example spread to other Primarchs or to the wider Imperium, the entire foundation of the imperial truth would be undermined. People would worship the Emperor as a god, regardless of his denials, feeding him power in the warp and potentially transforming him into the very thing he claimed not to be. This fear was realized after the heresy. The Imperium, traumatized by the betrayal and desperate for something to believe in, embraced the Lectitio Divinitatis, Lorgar's text proclaiming the Emperor's divinity. The imperial cult grew into the dominant religion of the Imperium, worshipping the Emperor as the God-Emperor of mankind, despite everything he had said and done to prevent such worship. Lorgar's spiritual vision, though corrupted by chaos, had ultimately triumphed over the Emperor's secular rationalism. The Emperor's fear of what Lorgar represented had been entirely justified. Conrad Kersey embodied a different fear, the fear of uncomfortable truth and the exposure of hypocrisy. Kersey saw the future, terrible visions of darkness and death that drove him gradually into madness. But his visions also showed him truths about the Emperor and the Imperium that others preferred to ignore. Kersey saw through the pretenses of nobility and justice that cloaked imperial conquest. He recognized that the Imperium was built on violence and terror as much as any tyranny it claimed to oppose. He understood that the Emperor used whatever methods achieved his goals, regardless of the moral cost. This recognition made Kersey simultaneously a useful tool and a dangerous liability. His methods of bringing compliance to worlds through terror and mass murder were effective, but also revealed the dark heart of imperial conquest in ways that damaged the Imperium's self-image. Kersey forced the Emperor and his brothers to confront the reality that they were conquerors, enforcing their will through violence, not liberators, bringing enlightenment to grateful populations. This truth was corrosive to the myths the Imperium told itself about its own righteousness. The Emperor feared what Kersey represented, the possibility that the lies and rationalizations that justified imperial conquest would be exposed as hollow. If the Imperium's nobility was false, if its claims to moral superiority were propaganda, then what distinguished it from any other tyranny seeking to dominate humanity? Kersey's existence asked these questions simply by being what he was, a monster created by the Emperor and unleashed upon the galaxy in the Emperor's name. The Emperor could not simply eliminate Kersey without admitting that his creation was flawed, but allowing Kersey to continue operating exposed the dark truth about imperial methods. Angron represented perhaps the most tragic of the Emperor's fears, the fear of a weapon that could not be controlled or repaired. When the Emperor found Angron on Nuceria, the Primarch was about to make his final stand alongside his fellow slaves against their oppressors. The Emperor could have saved all of them, could have deployed his forces to help Angron win that battle and free his comrades. Instead, he simply teleported Angron away, leaving the others to be slaughtered while he claimed his son. This decision haunted the relationship between the Emperor and Angron forever. The Primarch never forgave his father for that abandonment, never accepted the Emperor's authority as legitimate. Worse, Angron had been implanted with the Butcher's nails, technological implants that killed his capacity for complex emotion and left him capable only of rage. The nails were slowly killing him, degrading his brain and turning him into a berserker incapable of the strategic thought he had been designed to possess. The Emperor could have removed the nails, or at least, he could have tried. He had the most advanced technology and the most skilled geneticists in the galaxy. But according to the conversation with Archon Land, the Emperor chose not to try saving Angron. The Primarch was a weapon that still functioned, albeit in a damaged way. He could be pointed at the enemy and let loose. His legion would follow their father into the most brutal combat imaginable. Angron's suffering and impending death were acceptable costs for the utility he provided. The Emperor feared Angron, not because of what the Primarch might do, but because of what he represented, a completely uncontrollable element within the supposedly perfect hierarchy of the Imperium. Angron could not be reasoned with, could not be manipulated through the usual means, could not be trusted to follow orders unless those orders involved killing. He was a weapon that might turn on anyone at any moment, including his own allies. The Emperor kept Angron around because he was useful, but that usefulness came with the constant fear that the Berserker might prove more liability than asset. The Lost Primarchs, the 2nd and the 11th, represented perhaps the ultimate expression of the Emperor's fear. These Primarchs were found, given command of their legions, and then something happened that caused the Emperor to order their complete erasure from Imperial records. Whatever they did, whatever they became, it was so threatening to the Emperor, or to the success of the Great Crusade, that he decided the only solution was to eliminate them entirely and remove all evidence they had ever existed. We can only speculate about what the Lost Primarchs did to earn this fate. Perhaps they refused to accept the Emperor's authority, attempting to establish their own independent domains. Perhaps they were corrupted by chaos early and had to be destroyed before that corruption could spread. Perhaps they demonstrated such instability or such horrific methods that even the Emperor could not justify keeping them active. Whatever the cause, their erasure demonstrated that the Emperor was willing and able to eliminate Primarchs who proved too problematic, and that this capability hung over the heads of all the remaining Primarchs as an unspoken threat. Each of these Primarchs represented a specific fear the Emperor harbored about what his creations might become. Magnus showed that psychic power and knowledge could rival his own. Horus demonstrated that charisma and position could create loyalties that exceeded even the Emperor's authority. Lorgar proved that spiritual hunger could not be suppressed by rational argument. Kersey revealed uncomfortable truths about the Imperium's nature. Angron embodied the danger of weapons that could not be controlled. The Lost Primarchs showed that the Emperor would eliminate his own sons if they threatened his plans. These were not abstract fears, but concrete threats that materialized during the Great Crusade and exploded into catastrophe during the heresy. The Emperor's fears were justified by events, which only reinforced them and made him even more controlling and suspicious of his remaining sons. But that increased control and suspicion further alienated the Primarchs, creating a vicious cycle that ensured the betrayal the Emperor feared would eventually come to pass. The fear realized how the heresy proved him right. The Horus heresy was the ultimate validation of the Emperor's fears regarding the Primarchs. the moment when every concern he had harbored about these powerful beings crystallized into catastrophic reality. Half of the Primarchs turned traitor, taking their legions with them and plunging the galaxy into a civil war that nearly destroyed the Imperium and left the Emperor himself crippled and entombed on the Golden Throne. Everything he had feared about the Primarchs' potential to rival his power, to threaten his authority, to turn against his vision for humanity, came to pass in this most devastating way possible. The speed and completeness of the betrayal must have been shocking even to the Emperor, who had planned for the possibility of Primarch rebellion. Within a few short years, 9 Primarchs had declared themselves traitors. Horus, Fulgrim, Perturabo, Mortarion, Magnus, Angron, Lorgar, Alfarius, and Conrad Kurz. Each brought his entire legion with him, roughly 100,000 Space Marines per legion, creating a military force that rivaled the Loyalist side in both numbers and capability. The fact that so many Primarchs could be turned, and turned so quickly, demonstrated the fragility of the loyalty the Emperor had believed he commanded. The reasons for each Primarch's betrayal varied, but certain common threads ran through all of them, threads that traced directly back to the Emperor's treatment of his sons and the fears that had shaped that treatment. Horus turned because he felt abandoned when the Emperor withdrew to Terra, because he was shown visions of a future where he and his brothers were forgotten and discarded, because chaos offered him validation and power that he felt the Emperor had denied him. The Emperor's fear of Horus becoming too powerful, his decision to keep the War Master ignorant of the Webway project and his true plans, had created exactly the kind of resentment and suspicion that chaos could exploit. Lorgar's betrayal was even more directly the result of the Emperor's fear-driven policies. The humiliation of Monarchia, the brutal rejection of Lorgar's worship, had driven the Word-Bearer's Primarch to seek other gods worthy of his devotion. He found them in the Chaos Gods, and he spent decades secretly corrupting other legions before the heresy even began. If the Emperor had handled Lorgar's spiritual nature differently, if he had trusted the Primarch with the truth about chaos and explained why worship was dangerous rather than simply punishing it, Lorgar might have remained loyal. Instead, the Emperor's fear of religious devotion drove Lorgar directly into the arms of beings who welcomed and encouraged such devotion. Magnus's fall was perhaps the most tragic validation of the Emperor's fears. The Emperor had trusted Magnus with more knowledge about the warp than any other Primarch, had planned for him to be integral to the Webway project, but had also forbidden him from practicing sorcery after the Council of Nicaea. When Magnus tried to warn the Emperor about Horus's corruption, he used the very sorcery that had been forbidden, and in doing so, he accidentally destroyed the Emperor's most important project. The Emperor's response was to order Magnus's arrest and possibly execution, sending Leman Russ and the Space Wolves to bring him to account. The attack on Prospero, manipulated by Horus to become an attempted genocide rather than an arrest, drove Magnus into the arms of Tzeentch and made the Thousand Sons traitors. The Emperor's fear that Magnus's knowledge and power made him dangerous had led to policies that, when events turned against them, pushed Magnus into exactly the kind of rebellion the Emperor had feared. If the Emperor had trusted Magnus more fully, had made him a true partner in the Webway project, rather than just a tool to be used, the Primarch might have remained loyal even after his terrible mistake. The other traitor Primarchs each had their own reasons for turning, but in almost every case, those reasons traced back to treatment they had received that made them feel used, disrespected, or expendable. Perturabo felt that his legion was given the hardest, most thankless tasks, while others received glory and recognition. Mortarion harbored resentment about how the Emperor had defeated him on Barbarous, claiming a victory that Mortarion felt belonged to himself. Angron had never forgiven the Emperor for abandoning his fellow slaves. Kersey saw his visions of the Emperor's hypocrisy confirmed. Even Fulgrim, who seemed the most content and successful of the Primarchs, fell to chaos through a combination of pride and the weapon he carried, a demon-possessed blade that eventually corrupted him. His fall demonstrated that even the most loyal Primarchs were vulnerable to the chaos corruption that the Emperor's bargain on Molech had made them susceptible to in the first place. The heresy proved that the Emperor's fears about the Primarchs rivaling his power were entirely justified. When Horus, empowered by all four Chaos gods, faced the Emperor aboard the Vengeful Spirit, the Warmaster had become strong enough to actually threaten his creator's life. The Emperor was reluctant to use his full psychic power against his beloved son, and that hesitation nearly cost him everything. Only after Horus had mortally wounded him and killed Sanguinius did the Emperor finally unleash the full extent of his power, obliterating Horus so completely that even his soul was destroyed. But even this total victory came at a catastrophic price. The Emperor was broken, his body so damaged that only the Golden Throne could sustain his life. He would spend the next 10,000 years trapped in a living death, unable to guide the Imperium except through the most limited means, watching as everything he had built was twisted into a parody of his vision. The secular Imperium became a theocracy worshipping him as a god. The rational enlightenment he had championed devolved into superstition and ignorance. The united humanity he had sought to create was fractured and besieged on all sides. The heresy also demonstrated the threat that the Primarchs' charisma and ability to inspire loyalty represented. When the traitor Primarchs turned, they took not just their legions but also significant portions of the Imperial army, the Mechanicum, and the civilian population with them. Entire worlds joined the rebellion simply because the local Primarch or his representatives told them to. The Primarchs had become alternative centers of authority. Within the Imperium, nodes of loyalty that could command devotion equal to or exceeding what the Emperor himself inspired. This was exactly what the Emperor had feared. His carefully constructed hierarchy, with himself at the apex and everything flowing from his will, had fractured along lines of personal loyalty to the Primarchs rather than ideological commitment to the Imperium. The Primarchs had become not just generals, but leaders of factions, and those factions had proven willing to follow their leaders into rebellion against the Emperor himself. The fact that 9 Primarchs turned traitor, while only 9 remained loyal, with 2 already lost, showed how precarious the Emperor's control over these beings had always been. The outcome of the heresy was decided by the narrowest of margins. If 1 or 2 more Primarchs had chosen the traitor side, if Sanguinius had not remained loyal despite his prophetic knowledge of his own death, if Guilliman had not survived the Battle of Calth to rally the forces of Ultramar, the Emperor would have lost. His fears about the Primarchs potentially destroying him and his vision were vindicated in the most terrible way. But the heresy also revealed the tragedy inherent in the Emperor's fear-driven approach to managing the Primarchs. Many of the traitor Primarchs turned not because they were inherently evil or because chaos had simply corrupted them from pure loyalty, but because they felt betrayed, used, and undervalued by the Emperor. They turned because the Emperor's treatment of them as tools rather than sons had created wounds that chaos could exploit. They turned because the lies and secrets the Emperor kept from them left them vulnerable to manipulation when chaos told them truths he had concealed. If the Emperor had trusted the Primarchs more, if he had treated them as genuine partners rather than potentially dangerous weapons to be managed, if he had been honest about chaos and his plans for the future, the heresy might never have happened, or at the very least, fewer Primarchs would have fallen. The Emperor's fears had shaped policies that created the very betrayal he feared, making those fears self-fulfilling prophecies. The loyal Primarchs who remained stood testament to the fact that the Emperor's fears were not entirely justified. These Primarchs, Guilliman, Dawn, Sanguinius, the Lion, Russ, Vulcan, Corax, the Khan, and Ferrus Manus, remained loyal despite having every reason to feel the same grievances as the traitors. They had been kept ignorant, manipulated, used. They had sacrificed everything for the Emperor's vision. Yet they chose loyalty, fighting to the death or disappearing into myth to protect the Imperium even after the Emperor could no longer actively lead them. This loyalty suggests that the Emperor's approach to managing the Primarchs was not necessary, that trust and genuine partnership might have secured better results than manipulation and control. But the Emperor, trapped by his own fears and his inability to truly understand beings less powerful than himself, could not take that risk. He feared what the Primarchs might become if given full knowledge and trust, and that fear made him choose control over partnership. That choice, validated by the heresy's occurrence, but also partly caused by it, defined both the Emperor's relationship with the Primarchs and the ultimate fate of the Imperium. The fear was realized. The Primarchs had proven capable of threatening the Emperor, capable of rivaling his power, capable of choosing their own paths, even when those paths led to damnation and civil war. But in being proven right about the danger, the Emperor also had to confront the possibility that his own fear-driven policies had created that danger. The heresy was both validation of his concerns and condemnation of his approach, a tragedy written in the blood of billions that proved everyone involved, both right and wrong, in ways they could never have anticipated. Guilliman's return, the fear that endures. 10,000 years after the heresy, after millennia of the Emperor's imprisonment on the Golden Throne, one of the loyal Primarchs returned. Robert Guilliman, Primarch of the Ultramarines and Lord Commander of the Imperium during the Reformation, was resurrected from his stasis and brought back to serve a dying Imperium that teetered on the edge of annihilation. His return should have been a moment of hope and reunion, a chance for the Emperor to welcome back his son and work with him to save the Imperium. Instead, Guilliman's encounter with the Emperor revealed that even after 10 millennia of suffering, even facing the potential extinction of everything he had built, the Emperor's fundamental nature remained unchanged. He still feared the Primarchs. He still saw them as tools rather than sons. And that fear colored even this moment when he needed Guilliman more than ever. When Guilliman stood before the Golden Throne and communed with the Emperor, he was disturbed and heartbroken by what he encountered. The being on the Golden Throne had lost all pretense of humanity, if such pretense had ever truly existed. The Emperor gave off an overwhelming sense of coldness, a complete absence of the warmth or affection one might expect from a father greeting a long-lost son. The Emperor looked upon Guilliman with interest, but it was the interest of a craftsman examining a tool, not a father welcoming a son. The Emperor called Guilliman both tool and son, and the last hope to save mankind. But Guilliman could sense which of these designations was most true to the Emperor's thoughts. This encounter shattered many of Guilliman's assumptions about the Emperor and their relationship. Throughout the heresy and in all the years that followed, Guilliman had believed that the Emperor loved the Primarchs, that he cared for them as a father cares for sons. He had believed that the Emperor's apparent coldness was the result of the terrible burden he carried, the necessity of making hard choices for the greater good of humanity. Now, standing in the presence of the Emperor's unfiltered consciousness, Guilliman realized that this had always been a comfortable fiction. The Emperor had never loved the Primarchs. He had allowed them to call him father, had let them believe he loved them. But this had been manipulation, a technique of control rather than genuine affection. The Emperor had cloaked his true nature in the appearance of paternal care, but now, with his consciousness spread across 10,000 years of psychic struggle and his body reduced to a withered corpse on a throne, he no longer bothered with the pretense. Guilliman saw his father, his creator, his emperor for what he truly was, a being so far removed from normal humanity, so focused on his ultimate goals, that individual lives and feelings, even those of his own creations, were mere variables in a cosmic calculation. What makes this revelation even more significant is that it demonstrates the Emperor's fear of the Primarchs endures even now, even after everything that has transpired, even facing an Imperium that desperately needs the Primarchs' leadership and capability. The Emperor could have welcomed Guilliman back with warmth, could have made him a true partner in the effort to save the Imperium, could have trusted him with full knowledge and authority. Instead, the Emperor kept Guilliman at a distance, treating him as a useful resource to be deployed rather than as an ally to be trusted. This enduring fear is telling. After the heresy, the Emperor knows what the Primarchs are capable of, knows that even his most loyal sons can threaten his plans if they choose to act independently. He knows that Guilliman, as capable and loyal as he is, also possesses the intelligence and charisma to potentially chart a course for the Imperium that diverges from what the Emperor desires. The fear that the Primarchs might rival his authority, might make choices he disagrees with, might ultimately prove as much liability as asset, continues to shape how the Emperor relates to them. Guilliman, for his part, came away from the encounter deeply troubled. He had spent 10,000 years in stasis, had been revived into a nightmare future where everything he and his father had fought for had been twisted into a grotesque parody of itself. The Imperium he helped create was now a theocracy worshipping the Emperor as a god, built on superstition and ignorance rather than reason and enlightenment. Humanity was besieged on all sides, barely surviving rather than triumphant and expansive. The dream had died and been replaced with a nightmare of stagnation and suffering. In this context, Guilliman had hoped to find in his father a fellow being who shared his horror at what the Imperium had become, someone he could work with to reform and repair the damage of 10 millennia. Instead, he found a being who saw him as a tool to be used in service of goals that were never fully explained, who showed no warmth or partnership, who offered no comfort or guidance beyond the bare minimum necessary to deploy Guilliman back into the galaxy to fight. The Emperor's continued fear of Guilliman, even in these desperate circumstances, raises troubling questions about his true priorities. Is the Emperor more concerned with maintaining absolute control than with actually saving the Imperium? Does he fear that Guilliman, given too much autonomy or knowledge, might create an Imperium that diverges from his original vision, even if such divergence might be necessary for survival? Does he believe that even now, even after the heresy proved how destructive his fear-driven policies could be, that maintaining distance and control over the Primarchs is more important than forming genuine partnerships with them? The answer appears to be yes. The Emperor's nature is fundamentally unchanged by 10,000 years of suffering. He remains a being who sees the Primarchs as means to an end, rather than as individuals with value beyond their utility. This is not because the suffering has hardened him or stripped away his humanity, as Guilliman initially thought. It is because the Emperor never possessed the kind of humanity that would allow him to see the Primarchs as anything other than tools. His fear of what they represent, of their potential to rival or threaten his control, is so fundamental to his being that even the direst circumstances cannot overcome it. Guilliman's response to this revelation is instructive. Rather than being broken by the knowledge that his father never loved him, Guilliman has chosen to continue serving the Imperium anyway. But his service is no longer motivated by filial loyalty or devotion to the Emperor's vision. Instead, Guilliman serves because humanity needs him, because the Imperium, for all its flaws and horrors, is the only thing standing between humanity and extinction. He serves despite the Emperor, rather than because of him. This represents a fundamental shift in how at least one Primarch relates to the Emperor. Guilliman is no longer seeking the Emperor's approval or trying to fulfill his vision. He is making his own choices about what the Imperium needs, implementing reforms that the Emperor might not approve of, operating with a level of independence that would have terrified the Emperor during the Great Crusade. In a sense, Guilliman has become exactly what the Emperor always feared, a Primarch who acts according to his own judgment rather than simply following orders, who commands loyalty independent of the Emperor's will, who represents an alternative vision for humanity's future. But ironically, this independence might be exactly what the Imperium needs. Guilliman's reforms, his attempts to rationalize the imperial bureaucracy and improve the Imperium's military effectiveness, his efforts to push back against the worst excesses of the ecclesiarchy and the Inquisition, All of these actions are necessary for the Imperium's survival. The Emperor's 10,000-year absence has left the Imperium rudderless and rotting. It needs someone with the authority and capability to make decisions and implement changes. Guilliman, operating independently according to his own judgment, while still nominally serving the Emperor, might be the only thing that can save the Imperium from collapse. This creates a paradox. The Emperor feared giving the Primarchs too much independence because they might use it in ways he could not control. Now, the only hope for the Imperium's survival might be a Primarch doing exactly that, acting independently, making decisions based on his own judgment, implementing policies that the Emperor might not approve of. The fear that once shaped every interaction between Emperor and Primarch has become counterproductive in the face of existential threats that require decisive action rather than careful control. Yet the Emperor's fear endures. Even as Guilliman works to save the Imperium, even as the returned Primarch proves his loyalty through action rather than just words, the Emperor maintains his distance and his suspicion. The relationship remains fundamentally unchanged from what it was during the Great Crusade. A master deploying a tool, not a father working with a son. The Emperor's fear of the Primarch's potential is so deeply rooted that even 10 millennia of catastrophe cannot overcome it. This raises the question of what would happen if more Primarchs returned. Several of the loyal Primarchs are known or suspected to be alive somewhere in the galaxy. The Lion has already returned, emerging from his long sleep to fight in the Emperor's name. Vulcan is a perpetual and has appeared throughout Imperial history. Russ is prophesied to return at the Imperium's darkest hour. Korax still hunts traitor Primarchs in the Eye of Terror. Khan is lost in the webway, but not confirmed dead. If these Primarchs were to return and gather together, would the Emperor welcome them as desperately needed reinforcements? Or would he fear what they might do with their combined power and authority? Would he see them as the salvation of the Imperium or as potential threats to his control? Based on his treatment of Guilliman, the answer seems clear. The Emperor would use them, would deploy them against the Imperium's enemies, but he would not trust them, would not make them true partners, would maintain the same fearful distance that has characterized his relationship with the Primarchs from the moment of their creation. This enduring fear, this inability or unwillingness to move beyond seeing the Primarchs as threats to be managed rather than allies to be trusted, might ultimately prove more dangerous to the Imperium than any external enemy. The Imperium needs the Primarchs' leadership, their capability, their charisma, and strategic genius. But it also needs them to be able to work together, effectively, to coordinate their efforts without constant interference or suspicion from above. The Emperor's fear makes such cooperation difficult, if not impossible, as it always has. Guilliman's return demonstrates that the fundamental dynamic between Emperor and Primarch remains unchanged after 10,000 years. The fear that shaped the Great Crusade, that contributed to the heresy, that defined the Emperor's approach to his most powerful creations, endures. The Emperor still fears the Primarchs. He still sees them as potential rivals rather than as sons or allies. And that fear continues to shape the fate of the Imperium, perhaps as much as any action taken by the Imperium's enemies. The philosophical threat. More than physical power, beyond the immediate physical and political threats the Primarchs represented, there existed a deeper, more philosophical danger that may have been the true source of the Emperor's fear. The Primarchs were not merely powerful warriors or capable generals. They were living embodiments of ideas, principles, and ways of being that could inspire devotion and shape cultures. They represented alternative visions of what humanity could be, alternative models of leadership and authority that did not require the Emperor's existence or approval. This made them threats on a level that went far beyond their ability to win battles or command armies. The Emperor's vision for humanity was specific and singular. He sought to create a species that had evolved beyond its current limitations, a psychic race that could navigate the warp safely, and build a civilization independent of chaos's corrupting influence. To achieve this vision, humanity needed to be guided, shaped, and protected through a carefully planned progression of stages. The Emperor saw himself as uniquely qualified, perhaps uniquely capable, of guiding humanity through this evolution. His plan required absolute control over humanity's development, with no deviation from the path he had set. The Primarchs threatened this vision simply by existing as alternatives to the Emperor. Each Primarch embodied a different approach to leadership, a different set of values, a different vision of what humanity could become. Guilliman represented rational governance and civic virtue. Sanguinius embodied nobility and self-sacrifice. The Lion demonstrated honor and strategic brilliance. Russ showed that strength and loyalty could coexist with savagery. Vulcan proved that compassion and humanity could survive even in the most brutal warrior. These alternative models of leadership and existence were not inherently opposed to the Emperor's vision, but they were independent of it. A person could admire Guilliman's rationality without accepting the Emperor's authority. A world could be inspired by Sanguinius's nobility without worshipping the Emperor as master of mankind. The Primarchs provided alternative centers of meaning and inspiration, alternative answers to questions about how one should live and what one should value. This philosophical independence was perhaps more threatening than physical power, because it could not be controlled through force or manipulation. The Emperor could limit what the Primarchs knew, could control where they were deployed, could even, as with the lost Primarchs, eliminate those who became too problematic. But he could not control what the Primarchs inspired in others simply by being what they were. Their mere existence as alternatives to the Emperor created possibilities that threatened his monopoly on defining humanity's future. Consider the question of worship and devotion. The Emperor insisted there were no gods and that he should not be worshipped. This was necessary for his plan because worship fed the Chaos gods, strengthening the very powers he sought to protect humanity from. But the Primarchs, particularly Sanguinius, inspired religious devotion simply through their presence. People looked upon these transhuman beings and saw divinity, saw something worthy of worship and reverence. The cults that formed around various Primarchs during the Great Crusade were not officially sanctioned, but they were also difficult to suppress because the inspiration they drew from was genuine. This created a fundamental problem for the Emperor's secular vision. If people would not or could not accept a universe without gods, if they insisted on finding transcendent meaning and purpose in figures they deemed worthy of worship, then the Emperor's attempt to create a rationalist, atheistic civilization was doomed from the start. The Primarchs proved this by inspiring exactly the kind of devotion the Emperor claimed humanity needed to move beyond. They showed that the human need for meaning and connection to something greater than oneself could not be suppressed by decree, that it would find outlets regardless of official ideology. Lorga understood this better than his brothers. His word-bearers spread worship of the Emperor despite his prohibitions, because Lorga recognized that humanity needed gods, needed objects of devotion and sources of transcendent meaning. When that devotion was rejected and redirected toward chaos, it demonstrated the danger of trying to suppress rather than channel humanity's spiritual impulses. The Emperor's fear of being worshipped, his insistence that there were no gods, created a vacuum that chaos was eager to fill. But the philosophical threat went beyond questions of worship. The Primarchs represented different answers to the fundamental question of what a transhuman being should be and how such a being should relate to baseline humanity. Should they be distant and godlike, as the Emperor was? Should they be accessible and compassionate, as Vulcan demonstrated? Should they rule through fear and discipline, as Kersey believed? Should they inspire through noble example, as Sanguinius showed? Should they be brothers to their warriors, as Russ practiced? Each approach had merit. Each worked in certain contexts and for certain purposes. But each also represented a vision of post-human existence that did not require the Emperor's specific plan for humanity's evolution. If humanity could produce beings like the Primarchs, beings who were clearly superior to baseline humans, yet who could exist in various relationships with those they led, why did humanity need to follow the Emperor's singular vision? Why not allow multiple models of transhuman existence and leadership to coexist and compete? Why insist on one path when many might be viable? The Emperor could not allow such pluralism because his plan required singular vision and unified direction. Multiple competing visions of humanity's future would create the kind of division and conflict that could derail the careful progression he had planned. The Primarchs had to be subordinate to him, not just politically and militarily, but philosophically. They had to be prevented from becoming alternative sources of vision and meaning, alternative answers to humanity's fundamental questions about existence and purpose. This is why the Emperor kept the Primarchs separated, why he encouraged their rivalry with each other, why he never allowed them to form a unified philosophical or political bloc. If the Primarchs had been able to compare notes, to share their different approaches and learn from each other's perspectives, they might have developed a collective vision for humanity that was independent of the Emperor's. They might have asked dangerous questions about whether his way was the only way, whether his authority was necessary for humanity's success, whether beings of their power and capability should accept permanent subordination to anyone. The Emperor's fear was that the Primarchs, if given the opportunity to think collectively rather than individually, would recognize that they did not need him. They were powerful enough, intelligent enough, charismatic enough to guide humanity without his oversight. They could offer competing visions of humanity's future, multiple paths forward, rather than the singular vision he insisted upon. They represented the possibility of a post-Emperor humanity, beings who could fill the role he had assumed for himself, without requiring his specific vision or authority. This threat was existential, in a way that even military rebellion was not. The heresy proved that the Emperor could defeat the Primarchs in open combat, at least if they were divided against themselves. But he could not defeat the ideas they represented, could not prevent them from inspiring alternative visions of what humanity could be. Even in death, even in defeat, the Primarchs continued to shape how people thought about power, leadership, and human potential. Consider what each Primarch's legacy represents philosophically. Sanguinius's sacrifice proved that nobility and self-knowledge of one's own fate could coexist, that one could see death approaching and still choose to face it with courage. This is a powerful philosophical statement about human agency and dignity that exists independent of the Emperor's vision. Guilliman's Codex, Astartes, represents a complete philosophy of military organization and civic responsibility that functions whether or not the Emperor is present to guide it. Dawn's fortifications stand as monuments to the idea that defense and preservation are as noble as conquest and expansion. Even the traitor Primarchs offer philosophical lessons, albeit dark ones. Horus proved that charisma and competence can rival institutional authority. Magnus demonstrated that the pursuit of knowledge can lead to terrible consequences, but that the hunger for understanding is fundamental to the human condition. Angron showed what happens when empathy is destroyed and how rage can become the only remaining human emotion. Kersey revealed the hypocrisy at the heart of imperial justice and the danger of enforcing morality through terror. These lessons, these philosophical positions, exist and continue to influence how people think regardless of what the Emperor wants or teaches. They are independent sources of meaning and understanding that do not require the Emperor's vision to be valid or valuable. This made the Primarchs threats on a level that the Emperor could never fully control or eliminate. He could kill them, could imprison them, could erase their names from records, but he could not erase the ideas and possibilities they represented simply by existing as alternatives to himself. The Emperor feared this philosophical independence because it undermined his entire project. If the Primarchs could inspire loyalty, could provide meaning, could offer visions of humanity's future that did not require his specific plan, then his authority became contingent rather than absolute. People might choose to follow Guilliman's vision of rational governance over the Emperor's grand plan for psychic evolution. They might prefer Vulcan's compassion to the Emperor's cold calculation. They might find Sanguinius's nobility more inspiring than the Emperor's distant power. This fear was ultimately about the Emperor's recognition that he was not, despite his power and age, irreplaceable. The Primarchs proved that other models of transhuman leadership were possible, that his specific vision was one option among many rather than the only possible path forward. This was intolerable to a being who had spent millennia positioning himself as humanity's necessary guide, who had built his entire plan around the assumption that only he could lead humanity to its destined evolution. The philosophical threat the Primarchs represented was thus more fundamental and more dangerous than any physical threat they might pose. They offered proof that the Emperor's authority was not necessary, that his vision was not inevitable, that humanity might find other ways forward that did not require submission to his will. This made them existential threats to the Emperor's project in ways that no amount of military force could address. You cannot kill an idea. You cannot eliminate the possibility of alternative visions once they have been demonstrated to be viable. The Emperor's fear of the Primarchs on this philosophical level explains many of his seemingly irrational decisions. His insistence on keeping them ignorant and separated, his refusal to make them true partners in his vision, his willingness to risk rebellion rather than share real authority with them. All of these choices make more sense when we understand that he was not just trying to control powerful warriors, but trying to suppress the possibility of alternatives to his singular vision for humanity. The tragedy is that this fear blinded the Emperor to the value that genuine alternatives might have provided. If the Primarchs had been allowed to develop their own visions and approaches, if their different philosophical perspectives had been seen as resources rather than threats, the Imperium might have been more robust, more adaptive, more capable of surviving the challenges it would face. Instead, the Emperor's insistence on singular vision and absolute control created brittleness in the system, ensuring that when it did break, as it inevitably did during the heresy, the fracture was catastrophic and permanent. The Primarchs remain philosophical threats to this day. Guilliman has returned and is implementing reforms based on his own vision of what the Imperium needs, not simply executing the Emperor's will. The Lion has emerged and is making independent judgments about how to fight the Imperium's enemies. The loyal Primarchs, who may yet return, will bring with them their own perspectives and their own ideas about what should be done. The Emperor still fears what they represent, the possibility that humanity does not need him in the way he insists it does, that other paths forward exist, that his vision is not the only viable future for the species he claims to guide. This fear, this recognition that the Primarchs threaten his philosophical monopoly on defining humanity's future, may be the deepest and most enduring aspect of why the Emperor fears the Primarchs. It is a fear that no amount of power can address, no manipulation can suppress, no control can eliminate. It is the fear of being proven unnecessary, of being merely one option among many, rather than the singular answer to humanity's needs. And it is a fear that has shaped the fate of the galaxy for 10,000 years. Conclusion: the self-fulfilling prophecy of fear. As we reach the end of this exploration into why the Emperor fears the Primarchs, we must confront the ultimate irony and tragedy of this relationship. The Emperor's fear of the Primarchs, though rooted in legitimate concerns about their power and potential to rival his authority, created the very betrayal and catastrophe he sought to prevent. His fear was not unfounded. The Primarchs were indeed powerful enough to threaten him, independent enough to make their own choices, capable enough to potentially rival his authority. But in responding to that fear through control, manipulation, and systematic dehumanization of his own creations, the Emperor ensured that when rebellion came, it would be devastating and irrevocable. Consider the chain of causation. The Emperor created the Primarchs using power bargained from the Chaos Gods, making them inherently susceptible to corruption. He scattered them across the galaxy, whether by design or by allowing it to happen, ensuring they would be shaped by harsh circumstances rather than raised with care and understanding. He kept them ignorant of crucial information about chaos and the warp, leaving them vulnerable to manipulation when they finally encountered these forces. He treated them as tools rather than sons, refusing to offer the emotional connection and genuine partnership that might have secured their loyalty through love rather than mere obligation. He deliberately fostered rivalry between them, preventing the formation of bonds that might have made them a unified force. He kept secrets about his ultimate plans, making them feel excluded from the vision they were fighting to achieve. He demonstrated through the Thunder Warriors and the Lost Primarchs that he was willing to dispose of his creations when they had outlived their usefulness or become problematic. And when some Primarchs showed signs of spiritual hunger, emotional damage, or simple need for recognition and validation, he responded with punishment, humiliation, or cold indifference. Each of these decisions flowed from the Emperor's fear of what the Primarchs might become if given too much knowledge, too much power, too much independence. But each decision also created exactly the kind of resentment, vulnerability, and alienation that chaos would exploit to turn half the Primarchs traitor. The Emperor's fear made him unable to provide what the Primarchs needed to remain loyal: trust, honesty, respect, and genuine partnership. In trying to prevent the Primarchs from becoming threats, he made them into the very threats he feared. This is the tragedy of self-fulfilling prophecy. The Emperor saw a potential future where the Primarchs rebelled against him, and that vision shaped every interaction he had with them. But that treatment created the conditions that made rebellion inevitable. If he had trusted them, educated them properly about chaos, treated them as partners rather than tools, allowed them to form genuine bonds with each other, given them emotional support and recognition rather than just orders and expectations, the Horus heresy might never have happened. Or at the very least, fewer Primarchs would have fallen, and those who did might have been recognized and stopped before they could tear the Imperium apart. The Emperor's fear was the fear of a being so powerful and so ancient that he had difficulty understanding or empathizing with lesser beings, even when those beings were as mighty as the Primarchs. He saw them through the lens of power calculations and strategic deployment, rather than as individuals with emotional needs and psychological complexity. He assumed that control and management could substitute for genuine relationship and trust. He believed that his power and the rightness of his vision would be sufficient to maintain loyalty, without needing to actually earn it through decent treatment. This failure of understanding stemmed from the Emperor's fundamental nature. He was not human in any normal sense. He was a being of immense psychic power who had guided humanity for millennia, always from behind the scenes, always manipulating rather than leading openly. When he finally stepped into the light and took direct control through the Imperium, he brought with him the habits of manipulation and control that had served him in the shadows. But the Primarchs were not normal humans to be subtly influenced. They were transhuman demigods, capable of seeing through manipulation, capable of demanding more from their creator than mere orders and expectations. The Emperor's inability or unwillingness to meet those demands, driven by his fear of what would happen if he gave the Primarchs real partnership and authority, doomed the relationship from the start. The Primarchs needed a father, or at least a mentor who respected them as individuals. The Emperor could only see them as weapons that needed to be managed. This fundamental incompatibility, rooted in the Emperor's fear and his nature, made conflict inevitable. What does this tell us about power and control? The Emperor's story is a cautionary tale about the dangers of treating people as means rather than ends, even when those people are created for a specific purpose. The Primarchs were designed to be generals and conquerors, but they were also sentient beings with their own thoughts, feelings, and desires. They needed to be valued for who they were, not just for what they could do. The Emperor's failure to understand this, his fear-driven reduction of his sons to mere tools, created exactly the kind of resentment and alienation that would ultimately destroy his dreams for humanity. It also shows us that fear, even when based on legitimate concerns, can be counterproductive when it becomes the primary driver of decision-making. The Emperor was right to recognize that the Primarchs were powerful enough to threaten him, but responding to that recognition with control and manipulation, rather than with trust and partnership, made the threat worse rather than better. Fear is a useful warning system, but it is a terrible guide for action. It makes us defensive, controlling, unable to take the risks that genuine relationship requires. The Emperor's fear prevented him from taking the risk of trusting the Primarchs, and that failure to trust guaranteed that when they did eventually turn, they would do so with the kind of commitment and fury that comes from feeling fundamentally betrayed. The traitor Primarchs were not simply corrupted by chaos. They were driven into chaos's arms by a creator who had never valued them as anything more than tools, who had lied to them, manipulated them, and shown them through word and deed that they were expendable resources rather than cherished creations. Looking at the Imperium in the 41st millennium, we can see the long-term consequences of the Emperor's fear-driven approach to the Primarchs. The Imperium is a broken, stagnant horror show that betrays everything the Emperor claimed to want for humanity. It is superstitious rather than rational, oppressive rather than liberating, genocidal rather than unifying. It worships the Emperor as a god, despite his insistence that no gods existed. It has become the very thing he claimed to be fighting against, a tyranny that crushes human potential rather than enabling it. This happened because the Emperor's plan required the Primarchs to succeed, and his fear prevented him from using them effectively. The heresy broke the Imperium just as it was reaching the height of its power, turning the Great Crusade into a defensive struggle for survival. The Emperor himself was reduced to a corpse on a throne, able to watch, but not to act, as his vision was perverted into its opposite. The Primarchs who might have guided the Imperium wisely were either dead, corrupted, or disappeared, leaving humanity adrift without the leadership it needed. Now, 10,000 years later, the fear continues. Guilliman has returned, and the Emperor still treats him with suspicion rather than welcome. The Lion has emerged, and we can assume his relationship with the Emperor will be similarly cold and transactional. If more Primarchs return, they will face the same fundamental dynamic that has defined the Emperor's relationship with them from the beginning: a master's fear of his own creations, a refusal to trust or share real power, a determination to maintain control even at the cost of effectiveness. This ongoing fear raises the question: can the Imperium survive if the Emperor cannot move beyond fearing the Primarchs? The threats facing humanity in the 41st millennium are existential. The Great Rift has split the galaxy. Chaos is ascendant. Xenos threats multiply on every front. The Imperium needs the Primarchs' leadership desperately, but that leadership will be crippled if the Emperor insists on treating returned Primarchs as threats to be managed rather than as allies to be trusted. Guilliman has shown what Primarchs can accomplish when allowed to act according to their own judgment. His reforms have stabilized parts of the Imperium, improved military effectiveness, and pushed back against some of the worst excesses of imperial decay. But he has done this despite the Emperor rather than with his support, working around the master of mankind rather than with him. This is inefficient and unnecessarily difficult. Imagine what could be accomplished if the Emperor actually trusted Guilliman, if they worked together as true partners rather than as suspicious master and resentful tool. But such trust seems impossible, given the Emperor's fundamental nature and the fear that shapes it. He has spent 10,000 years on the Golden Throne, with his consciousness divided across countless tasks, fighting an endless war against chaos in the warp, serving as the astronomicon that guides ships through the darkness, holding closed the portal beneath the throne that would flood terror with demons if he faltered. This existence has not softened him or made him more understanding. If anything, it has reduced him further to pure will and purpose, stripping away whatever capacity for genuine human connection he might once have possessed. The Primarchs who return to serve this being find not a father who has learned from his mistakes, but a master who remains as cold and controlling as ever. The fear endures, the fundamental dynamic persists, and the Imperium suffers for it, deprived of the effective leadership that could only come from genuine partnership between the Emperor and his sons. What, then, is the lesson of the Emperor's fear? Perhaps it is this: that power without wisdom is ultimately self-defeating, that control without trust creates the very rebellion it seeks to prevent, that treating people as means rather than ends will eventually destroy even the most carefully laid plans. The Emperor was the most powerful being humanity had ever produced, but his power could not overcome his fundamental failure to understand and value the beings he had created. His fear of the Primarchs, though rooted in realistic assessment of their capabilities, blinded him to the fact that they needed to be trusted to be loyal, needed to be valued to be effective, needed to be treated as partners to remain committed to his vision. The Horus Heresy was not an unavoidable tragedy written in the stars. It was the predictable outcome of fear-driven policies that created resentment, vulnerability, and alienation in beings powerful enough to act on their grievances. The Emperor's fear made him unable to see that the greatest threat to his vision came not from the Primarchs' power, but from his own treatment of them. He created the very catastrophe he sought to prevent, and the galaxy has burned for 10,000 years as a result. As we look to the future of the Imperium, the question remains: can this pattern finally be broken? Can the Emperor move beyond his fear and learn to trust the Primarchs who remain or who return? Can the Primarchs themselves find ways to work effectively despite the Emperor's suspicion and control? Or will the fear that has defined this relationship from the beginning continue to cripple the Imperium, even as external threats press in from all sides? The answer may determine whether humanity survives the darkness that surrounds it. The Emperor fears the Primarchs, and that fear has shaped the fate of the galaxy. Whether it will continue to do so, whether humanity's potential saviors will be allowed to actually save it, or will be held back by the very being who created them, remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: the fear endures, and with it, the tragedy continues. The Emperor of mankind, Master of Terror, Lord of the Imperium, remains in the end a being defined by what he fears rather than what he loves. And the Primarchs, his greatest creations and his deepest fear, remain the living proof that power and control are no substitute for trust and genuine partnership. The galaxy burns. The Imperium crumbles. The Primarchs return to fight in a war that has never truly ended. And at the center of it all, on a throne of gold in a palace of bones, the Emperor watches through dying eyes and fears, always fears, the weapons he created, the sons he could not love, the threats that were born from his own choices. This is the tragedy of the Emperor and the Primarchs, a story 10,000 years old that shows no sign of ending. A story of fear and power, of creation and betrayal, of a being who could master the galaxy but could never master his own dread of what he had brought into being. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of the darkest relationships in Warhammer 40K lore, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There's so much more to explore in the grim darkness of the far future, and your support helps us continue bringing you these detailed examinations of the lore that makes this universe so compelling. Until next time, remember, in the darkness of the 41st millennium, even the greatest powers are shaped by their deepest fears.